Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Izuku has a Miss Quirk part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends, and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Izuku was always different from other children. He didn't run out in the yard and play with the animals or bugs. He didn't get invited to birthday parties, since he didn't really have any good friends. That was probably for the best, though. They'd probably be afraid of what he could do anyways. 15 years ago, Midoriya Inko and Midoriya Hasashi found a small bundle on their porch, wrapped up in black and gray cloth. It was like a scene straight out of a movie. Wrapped in the tassels was a small child, a boy, and a note. "Will you take care of him here, somewhere far away from that other place?" It was simple, short, and to the point, the implications obvious. Some stranger had left their unwanted child on the Midoriya's doorstep. Following the discovery, Hasashi and Inko broke out into a nasty fight. They both knew how bad the foster care system in Japan was, considering that most of the time, the weaklings just got left behind to deal with everything from malnourishment to abandonment. Inko wanted to keep the child. She'd always wanted a son, but hadn't quite been ready to brave pregnancy. But at the same time, Hasashi didn't want children at all. The fight ended with Hasashi screaming his way out of the house, leaving Inko alone with the babe. She'd been forced to sell the house and move into a small apartment in the middle of town. She worked long, hard hours, while also trying her best to provide for the child. She named him Izuku. Growing up was a lonely thing for Izuku. Inko was out working from early in the morning to late at night, so he was left to the daycare for most of the day. While there, he didn't interact much with the other children, preferring solitude to social interaction, which labeled him as the outcast. Maybe it was because all the other kids made fun of Izuku. His skin was extraordinarily pale, and his hair color didn't even match his mother's. Her dark green hair contrasted with his dark brown, and most people asked if he was even her son. He knew he wasn't. Izuku eventually asked for his mother to dye his hair green. In kindergarten, everyone started to get their quirks. It started with the blonde-haired kid, the loud one. Izuku was the only kid in the class that didn't fawn over the sparks emanating from his palms. Instead, he turned back to his books. More and more kids got their quirks as time went on. Some were relatively useless, some were flashy, and some were actually useful, although the majority fell into the first two categories. Ironically, even as he saw the variety of powers each of his classmates manifested, Izuku found himself hoping he didn't even get one for himself. Getting a quirk would make him stand out even more. Without some flashy superpower, he could blend into the background better. He could get ignored easier. The bullies would pick on him less. Coming home with bruises wasn't an uncommon occurrence. After the first couple of times, Izuku's mother had contacted the school and made a complaint about the bullying, but it didn't stop anything. The bullies just got smarter about where they hit him, bruising spots that were normally unexposed, knowing he wouldn't actively show off his injuries to his mother. To their credit, they were right. Izuku turned 4 and didn't have a quirk yet, so his mother took him to the quirk doctor. They did a variety of tests on him, and Izuku did as told without complaint. Even when they had to draw blood, he didn't cry and scream like a normal child would. He and his mother waited in the waiting room for at least an hour, which was odd, as the doctor mentioned that the results should be out in a few simple minutes. When the nurse finally came out and called their last name, Izuku heard his mother breathe out a sigh of relief. The doctor was sitting behind his desk. An unholy amount of papers sprawled out across his desk to the point that the tabletop underneath wasn't even visible when Izuku and Inko walked in. "Miss Midoriya, how do I say this?" The doctor paused. "Your son is the biggest anomaly I've ever seen." Izuku perked up. He'd been expecting the doctor to say that he was just quirkless. Inko tilted her head as well at the doctor's statement, attention likewise held. "Look here," he slid over an x-ray. "This is a scan of a child with a quirk's foot and your son's foot. Notice any difference?" Izuku looked at the paper as well, and after a moment, his mother shook her head. "No." The doctor pointed to an empty space by the pinky toe. "Exactly. If your son were quirkless, there would be an extra toe joint. It has to do with how we evolved, getting rid of the unneeded gene. So he's going to get a quirk?" Inko asked. Izuku sat back in his chair, unsure how to feel. Whether he got a quirk or not by this point, word would probably spread of his situation, which would once again mark him as unordinary. "Not so fast." The doctor brought up another piece of paper. "This is the results of the blood test I had taken after I noticed the toe joint. This is a visualization of a specific part of a genome, what's called a quirk factor. Simply put, it's the part of the genome that harbors the data for developing a quirk. You don't see a person with a quirk without one, and you don't see a quirkless person with one. Now this," he pulled out another paper, "is what we got back when we tried to run your son's genome." The data on the paper was very similar to the one he'd shown a moment before, with a variety of lines and letters, but the new one had one key difference. There was an entire section of Izuku's genome that was blank. There's no quirk factor. He doesn't have one, which can only mean that he's quirkless. The doctor sat back. "It conflicts with the toe joint, but it's the only conclusion I can safely come to." Izuku let out a breath. "Quirkless after all. Maybe the kids at school would stop asking him when his quirk would come in and finally leave him alone. He and Inko thanked the doctor and left the hospital shortly after. Izuku and Inko were on the way back from the doctor's appointment when it happened. Everything had been going so smoothly on the light rail. Nobody was giving Izuku weird looks, and his mother was holding his hand tightly. Out of all the things Izuku wished to hide from in the world, his mother was his one safe haven. She was the only person that he truly felt safe around, the only person that he could let himself relax with. She knew him better than anyone, and he really did love her, and the fact that she wasn't his biological mother did nothing to change that fact. She sacrificed so much for him, and he just wanted to find a way to repay her. He knew the story of how she brought him in. It was inevitable, considering how differently he looked from her. He knew how much hardship she faced because of him, especially after her husband walked out. She was his anchor, his guiding light. That's why Izuku clung onto her leg for support when the tram came to a screeching halt mid-transit. Everyone on board looked around in confusion as the doors to the train car were pried open, and a few men burst through, all wearing some sort of face mask, with the exception of the one in the middle, a tall, blonde man with massive, exposed muscles covering his entire body. It was a massacre. The muscled man attacked indiscriminately and with lethal force. There was blood on the walls, blood pooling on the floor. Inko cowered to the corner, holding Izuku tightly while the boy sat, frozen in what could only be described as sheer terror. The men were killing everyone for no reason. Bodies slumped to the cold ground one by one, nobody able to leave the tram, nobody able to fight back against the men. Inko covered his eyes, but it didn't stop him from catching a glimpse of one of the other passengers, having their heads slammed into the wall with an explosion of brain matter and blood. The blonde man Izuku had noticed earlier finally spotted him and Inko in the corner. He locked eyes with Izuku and licked his lips, walking over with the nightmarish, sadistic grin plastered on his face. Inko screamed as the punch came, but it was cut short as she fell limp a moment later. She didn't get back up. Izuku looked down at the body of his mother, and all went blank. Something snapped. Izuku fell to his knees and gazed up at the large man in front of him. He readied himself for the finishing blow that never came. All the rustling around the cabin of the tram car ceased as the men looked to each other, then to the carnage they'd just produced. As if coming to their senses, many of the men dropped their weapons, gasping in horror. They all fled the scene mere moments later. That left Izuku alone in the train car, a lone child in a graveyard. Izuku cried for the first time in his memory. Izuku was barely cognizant for the next few weeks. The police and heroes had arrived at the scene a few minutes later, and he had been taken back to the hospital with the rest of the victims. A few survived, but his mother wasn't one of them. Izuku was kept in the hospital for a while after the attack. It could have been a few weeks, it could have been a couple months, he didn't really know, nor did he really care. All that dominated his mind was the day-to-day routine. The doctors would come in and feed him and do some tests throughout the day. Some days he'd go to therapy, and some he'd go stay in his little hospital bed. Over time, Izuku realized that there were other children at the hospital as well. Some were afflicted with quirk problems, while others had more traditionally medical-related issues. The nurses tried to get him to interact with the other children, saying it would help with his recovery, but Izuku refused every time. They'd just bully and make fun of him for being different, and this time his mother wouldn't be there to stop them from going for the face. Things hardly got better with time. Izuku started to become more aware of the world around him, starting to focus on more than just his inner dread. He got out of his room a bit more, and he started actually talking to the therapist, not that it helped much. He heard the doctor's whispers. He wasn't getting any better, and soon they'd give up, just pawn him off to some child care facility. The last thing he wanted was to learn what those were like. Still, every time he tried to find the motivation to do anything, he failed. He just thought about how useless it would all be, if he'd be hopeless against a villain attack, just like his mother. He was quirkless after all. Everything changed when a very specific video came on the television one day. It depicted a massive man with pointy, blonde hair, holding up over 20 victims with ease, carrying them away from a massive fire that lit up the background. Someone talked over the video about how he'd already saved 3 times as many people. When Izuku asked the nurse who this was, she just nodded. "Oh, that old video. That's All Might's debut," she said with a hand wave. Then, she froze, noticing the look in the young boy's eyes. "Do you want me to rewind it?" Izuku didn't know what had him so mesmerized about the video as he watched it again. And again. And again, and again, and again. He watched the video over at least 20 times before the nurse said it was enough. Even after the television was off, he kept replaying it in his mind, imagining the booming words from the hero, as he carried entire families to safety. It was like a sense of hope. An impression that, despite everything, things would turn out alright. Despite everything that had happened to his mother, he'd turn out okay if he just fought. Then it clicked. Everything fell into place. That hero had saved those people, they'd have died without his help. They'd be like his mother, buried in the ground somewhere, cold and alone, and Izuku realized in that moment something that changed his life. If he could become a hero, he could fight for those people. People like his mother, who died because there wasn't a hero there to save her. He could save them. Naturally, heroes become an obsession for Izuku. It wasn't like other kids' passions, where they play a game of soccer outside a couple of times a week. No, every moment Izuku was able to, he was researching heroes, noting their quirks and their abilities, extrapolating their areas of strengths and weaknesses, and taking note on what kind of crime they fought. He started making notebooks, filling them with information on heroes. It gave him something to do other than wallow in despair. It was like a coping mechanism. He'd wake up, look at hero news on the hospital TV, go through the rest of the day, and take notes again before bed. The doctors must have noticed the progress, because in just 2 weeks, they released him from the hospital into foster care. 9 years later, Izuku stretched carefully as he woke up. His space was very limited, and while his room was private, which was better than most of the other foster children got, it was very minimalistic. The foster home didn't have very much space for too many kids to have their own rooms, but after being there for as many years as he had, he got some extra liberties. He sat up, brushing the covers off of his lap. He could smell the simple breakfast downstairs and he needed to at least eat before he headed to school, so he threw on his uniform, grabbed his most recent notebook, volume 15, and stuffed it in his backpack along with his laptop. He could copy down the hero news after he showed up to class early. Izuku was the first to class, as per usual. He didn't like to spend too much at the foster home, so he tended to arrive at school a little bit earlier than most students who weren't part of a club. It wasn't that he felt unwelcome at the house, far from it. Everyone was nice and welcoming, and many of the children looked up to him as an older brother. It was just that he felt like there were better things to be doing, always somewhere else to be. He frequently didn't return home until late at night, taking walks around the local area or working on homework at the park. Izuku was looking at news articles on his laptop when the rest of the class started to funnel in. Some regarded him, most didn't. He had a habit of trying to melt into the background whenever his classmates glanced in his direction, a leftover habit from his elementary school years. Most didn't even care about him anymore, but old habits die hard. The class started and Izuku put his laptop away. All of his subjects were a breeze, since he was a good student in every single subject. Of course, that was because G needed to be if he was going to get into UA. The day was long, but it wasn't any different than others. What Izuku really cared about was getting it all over with so he could go out into town and see if he could catch some hero action firsthand. Finally, homeroom came around, the last class before release. "Alright class, settle down," the teacher called. "I have an important announcement. Your high school application forms are due by tomorrow. Many of you have turned in your decisions, but a few of you have yet to turn it in." Izuku had turned his in on the day that he'd gotten it. He was going for the UA hero course, and it never hurt to be ahead of the game. He needed any advantage he could get, especially since his official file labeled him as quirkless. Not that his file was wrong, of course. "Bakugo, you going to UA, right?" the teacher asked. Izuku rolled his eyes as the blonde snickered, sitting up a little taller. Izuku hated it every time the teacher fed into the boy's ego. It was big enough as is. "Of course I am, teach. Who do you think I am, semester?" The teacher nodded. "Midoriya, you as well." Izuku's gut dropped as all the eyes in the room turned towards him. In the blink of an eye, he'd gone from pleasantly invisible to the center of attention. He wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. "Yes," he said softly. Izuku was aware of Bakugo's angry eyes on him. He shut his own, hoping that everyone would get the clue and back off. "Well," the teacher interrupted, clearing his throat and the awkward air that had fallen upon the classroom along with it. "That's it for today. You are dismissed." Izuku waited for most of the class to leave before putting his things away. He'd just gotten his laptop into his bag when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the teacher leave the room. As if on cue, Bakugo's hand came crashing down onto Izuku's desk with an explosion, and Izuku jumped out of it at the very same moment, narrowly avoiding getting blasted by the other boy's fit of rage. A moment later, Izuku's shirt was wrapped up in a tight, sizzling fist. "What are you on, thinking you'll be a hero?" Bakugo snapped. "I'm the only one in this piece of shit school worth anything. I'll be the only one to get into UA. You don't even have a quirk, you useless piece of shit." "He's right. You don't have a quirk. You're a freak, something different. Inko shouldn't have ever taken you in," a voice told him in the back of his mind. Izuku shoved aside the thoughts in favor of putting his energy into getting out of the altercation with a minimal amount of burn marks. Bakugo must have noticed his long pause, because he continued. "Listen here, you twerp. You're not going to apply to UA. Find somewhere else, freak." Bakugo's other hand, the one not pulling at Izuku's shirt, cackled with sparks right next to the pale boy's face. With an internal sigh, Izuku caved to the temptation. He knew he shouldn't, he'd just perpetuate the rumors, but he'd been through this song and dance already. Without some encouragement, the next thing Bakugo would do would be to use his quirk on Izuku, leaving yet another irritating blemish that would take a week to heal. Izuku used his luck. It was a tiny reserve, but it was enough. He tapped into the small well inside his consciousness, directing it towards Bakugo as unnoticeably as possible. Bakugo eyed Izuku for a moment, before dropping him. His anger seemingly subsided, just like every other time Izuku used his luck. Do yourself a favor, the explosion aficionado said on his way out, tone only slightly more neutral. Toss yourself off the building and hope you're born with a quirk next time. Worst case scenario, you join your mom in the ground. Izuku grimaced. The jab hurt, but it wasn't something he couldn't take. Only once Bikugo was gone did Izuku let up his pressure with the luck. He gathered his bag and headed towards the exit. Izuku discovered his luck a little while after living at the foster home. At first, everyone at school had given him space, respecting his loss. Then, as things do, everything returned to normal. People started picking on him again. And when that happened, Izuku learned something. Sometimes, he had something to fight back. It was only there every so often, and it was shoddy at best, but it was better than nothing. It was luck. When he used it, the people around him seemed to get less angry. As time went on, Izuku realized they became less, everything. All their emotions were softer, and they were more open to listening to him. Then came the confusion. What was this power? What was this luck? He was quirkless, so he couldn't have a quirk. He didn't even have a quirk factor. The ability to develop a quirk was quite literally not a part of his genetics. It had to be something else. Some other type of power. Another thing to make him different. Perhaps he should just start calling it a quirk. It would make everything easier on everyone else and himself. Yet, despite the fact that it was most logical to do so, he couldn't bring himself to lie like that. After all, he'd been registered as quirkless for years now. He couldn't just go back on it so far along without raising questions. So, he just left it as it was. He didn't even try to figure out anything about his luck, just used it when he needed to. Izuku sighed, passing under the bridge that he went under every day on the way back from school. It had a little river running by it and a man cover that led to the sewers. Some days, there'd be some koi fish in the sewer, which was odd and also a bit concerning, considering that sewage was most likely far from the healthiest environment for fish to be living in. Just as Izuku was about to leave the underpass, he heard the grinding sound of metal scraping against concrete. He whipped around, just in time to see something come crawling out of the manhole cover he just walked over. Oh, perfect. A disguise. A voice said, and the blob that had just emerged from the hole started to rush at Izuku. Izuku's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. He'd been a part of villain attack before, he wouldn't have it happen again. Izuku turned heel and ran as fast as his feet would take him. Hey, get back here. The thing called after him, but Izuku didn't look back. There would be heroes on the main road, if only he could just get there. The villain, its body a blob of sludge, was right on Izuku's heels. It was going to catch him if he didn't speed up. Izuku gritted his teeth and willed his legs to move faster. Get away, you'll die. Like reacting to a command, his body responded by moving faster. His legs felt less tired, bounding further with each step, and he felt more balanced, his legs didn't wobbling less as he ran. The power of adrenaline, Izuku thought as he frantically fled from the monster. He was gaining ground, now, and soon enough they'd be on the main road. Izuku kept running like his life depended on it, because it did, in all likelihood. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if the sludge caught up to him. Eventually, he burst out into the middle of an open street bustling with activity. He was in a crowded area now, so even if the sludge monster caught him, there would be heroes there to stop it. Then, everything slowed down. His rush, his extra boost seemed to have just run out. Izuku stumbled as he lost his balance, falling to the ground. A few pedestrians noticed him skirting around him ungracefully. Then, a moment later, they noticed the slime villain and ran away with a chorus of screams for help. Izuku tried to get up, but found his arms and legs to be extraordinarily tired, like he'd overexerted his body, as if he pushed himself beyond his breaking point. The sludge monster was on him in an instant. Slime covered Izuku's body and forced itself down his throat. The sludge smelled just like sewage, and the slimy texture made his skin crawl. He tried to claw at his captor, but his hands sunk straight through the liquidy body helplessly. He tried to scream, but no noise came out and he couldn't breathe. Finally caught you, twerp, the villain sneered. Now be a good kid and sit still so this can be over quickly. He tried to scrape the sludge away from his mouth again, but he found his arms and legs becoming weak as his body ran out of oxygen. As time went on, his limbs became too tired to do anything but sit uselessly under the slime. Izuku looked around the area frantically, searching for something, anything to come help him. Even his black spots started to fill his vision, and he ran out of air. Then, just as Izuku was about to give up hope, a figure came running out of the crowd. Izuku recognized him immediately as the professional hero Death Arms, marked by his signature metal arm braces that resembled construction tape. The hero ran forwards, straight towards the slime villain. He roared, throwing his arms forward to strike the sludge, only for his body to sink uselessly into the viscous liquid. The sludge villain turned, throwing Death Arms off with one powerful strike. Izuku watched as his help flew across the street like a discarded doll. Izuku couldn't fight back, the heroes couldn't get to him, and he was going to die. Oh god, he was going to die. He was going to die to a villain attack, just like his mother had. Izuku could feel his grip on consciousness slipping away, and he can't even move his body anymore. He frantically reached inside, searching for one last boost. One last drop of luck. But his luck had run out. He was out of luck, having used it all on Bakugo earlier. He couldn't do anything. Izuku felt even deeper in the confines of his mind, searching. He grasped at thin air, nothing coming. He pleaded into the metaphorical void, calling for anyone to help him. Then, he felt it. Another well of power. It was familiar, like his luck, but also different in its own way. Izuku seemed to gravitate towards it, and with one frantic leap, he grabbed a hold of the source. Translucent blue lines shot out from Izuku's chest, springing out towards around him seemingly at random. Not knowing what he was doing, Izuku grasped at them, hoping something would help. Suddenly, he felt a force run through him, like he was being compressed from 1,000 different directions. He screamed despite the sludge in his throat as everything around him distorted. The lampposts bent, street signs were blown from their bases, nails that held together merchant stands tore out of the wood, and the steel rebar in the concrete tried to shoot away, causing the pavement to crack. With one last effort, Izuku reversed his endeavor, reflexively pulling on all the blue lines instead of pushing. Everything stopped for a lasting moment before it all started to come right back. Thousands of pieces of metal shot directly towards Izuku and the sludge villain. Whatever power he'd drawn upon disappeared and the blue lines went with it, as did the tension pulling his body apart. The power was gone, but the damage had already been dealt. A spare nail sword, striking the sludge villain through the eye, and the monster recoiled, dropping Izuku on reflex. The boy barely had time to hit the ground before giant masses of debris shot through the air to where he'd been just a moment before. A street sign tore through the sludge villain's liquid body, just as hundreds of tiny pieces of debris shot through the form. The villain was reduced to tiny globules of slime in a mere moment. The last thing Izuku saw before he lost consciousness was a figure running through the crowd towards him. Everything went black. When Izuku awoke, he was laying down on some kind of soft bed. He opened his eyes, searching for clues as to what had happened. Only then did he realize he was in the back of an ambulance on a stretcher. He tried to sit up, only for his entire right side to flare up in an intense pain, and with a gasp, Izuku laid back down on the stretcher. "Oh, he's awake." A voice called from somewhere nearby. Izuku heard the sound of footsteps, quiet at first but gaining volume as their owner approached. Someone stopped right behind him and a couple seconds later he was sitting upright, pushed up by the stretcher. Izuku's side burned slightly, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been when he tried to sit up on his own. "What happened?" Izuku said groggily, rubbing a hand through his hair. He had a horrible headache. The man that had sat him up smiled, his paramedic uniform glistening in the artificial light of the ambulance. "You pass out after the fight with the villain. You've only been out for a few minutes. I missed the fight, but, judging by the aftermath, you did a good job, kid." The paramedic said it with a hint of awe in his voice. No, that couldn't be right. Izuku vaguely remembered the incident. He'd been acting on instinct the entire time, just trying to get away from his attacker. He remembered getting caught, then blue lines, then nothing. Suddenly, Izuku realized something frightening. Something far more frightening than even the villain had seemed. A foster home can't afford a medical bill like this. Izuku thought frantically, forcing himself to sit all the way up. His side screamed in protest, but he ignored it. "I have to get out." The paramedic placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. "Whoa there, slow down, bud. You've got a couple of cracked ribs." Izuku shook his head, getting onto his wobbly feet. "I'm fine, really," he said through gritted teeth. It hurt, but another medical bill was not something the foster home could afford. "I'll be going. Thanks for all the help." The paramedic moved to stop Izuku, but he didn't have to do very much. As soon as Izuku opened the back door, he was met with the form of a very familiar hero, and he froze on the spot when he noticed the telltale blonde spikes of hair. "They all might," Izuku blurted out, all of his worries trumped by the sheer power of shock. The hero seemed to have been in the middle of conversation with a detective, but he turned towards Izuku as soon as he heard his voice. "Ah." All Might turned away, facing Izuku fully. "You're up." He shouldn't be, the paramedic grumbled behind Izuku. Izuku, however, was completely flabbergasted. "Why, how, when? Why is," he sputtered. "Why is All Might here?" He'd hoped to one day meet his hero. It was his dream to work with All Might as a hero one day, but still, the last place he'd expected to see him was, well, here. All Might boomed with laughter, and even that simple action seemed to resonate throughout the entire area. Izuku didn't even need to be pushed back into a sitting position by the paramedic. He fell down on his own, rather ungracefully. "You did a good job dispelling that villain, young man," All Might said. "By the time I arrived on the scene, he'd already been taken care of. Though, I caution you to be more careful about the surroundings in the future. Quite the damage you caused." At this, All Might boomed with laughter again. Izuku tilted his head, slightly recovered from the shock of seeing his hero. "Damage." All Might gestured for Izuku to stand, and he followed, ignoring the pain in his side. He stepped out of the metal confines of the ambulance, and onto the very same street that the slime villain had caught up to him on. The good news is that it looked like everyone had cleaned up the sludge. The bad news is that the entire area was in shambles. Entire street lamps were bent sideways, street signs were torn from the ground, and all the merchant stands had either been knocked over or broken, the nails scattered throughout the entire street. The concrete was cracked, and in places, the steel rebar stuck out of the ground like a broken bone poking out of someone's leg. Izuku stared at the carnage in a mix of horror and awe. I did this? It didn't make sense. All he'd been able to do up until now was push a little bit on people's emotions, making them less likely to hurt him. Where did all this power come from? He was quirkless. He had to be quirkless. None of this made sense. That is some power, young All Might paused. Izuku tore his gaze away from the street, looking up at the great hero. The older man was looking at Izuku expectantly. My name? He's asking for my name. He realized. Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku. He said. He kept his mother's last name after she died. It wasn't like he knew who his real parents were anyways. Well, young Midoriya, this is an impressive display of power, if I've ever seen one. Are you trying to enroll in any hero programs? Izuku nodded nervously. The one at UA, sir. All Might smiled. I believe you'll do fantastic. Izuku's heart almost stopped. All Might, the symbol of peace, was telling him he could make it. He didn't know what to say, so he just stared back at the hero with a blank expression. All Might boomed with laugh once again. Well, I believe the ambulance can give you a ride home. All Might patted Izuku's shoulder. I need to be going. Izuku panicked. He couldn't get on the ambulance. They'd just charge him the medical bill. He'd never be able to pay it off. No, it's fine, I can walk. Nonsense. You've been injured, the least we can do is help you out a little, All Might said, nudging Izuku towards the ambulance. No, seriously, I'm fine, Izuku said, trying to sidestep the large hero. When All Might didn't let him go by, Izuku felt for his luck. There was a tiny bit left which didn't make sense considering he'd been out when the Silm villain attacked, but he had some now which is what mattered. Izuku nudged the last of his luck onto All Might. Izuku saw the change in his facial features as they grew softer, less determined. I really can make my own way home. Izuku tried to push past All Might just as his luck ran out. All Might, to Izuku's surprise, still didn't let him go. Despite the emotional push, All Might hadn't been convinced. My boy, there's no harm in taking the easy way home, All Might said, his voice softer. He crouched down a little bit so that he was on eye level with Izuku. Izuku let out a defeated sigh. He was too emotionally unstable for this. He just wanted to get away, to crawl back to his room and hide. I can't afford it, Izuku whispered, voice barely carrying to All Might's ears. The hero looked between Izuku and the ambulance, realization dawning on his face. The hero stood, waving the paramedic over. If there is any charge for his treatment, pull it directly from my pay for stopping this incident. The boy was the one that really did the work, and he needs it more than I, All Might said. The paramedic nodded in understanding. Izuku gaped at All Might. Nobody was that generous. Nobody would give up that, especially for someone like Izuku. Nobody except for All Might. Now, I really must be going, All Might said, crouching. When he left the ground, a burst of wind followed him, and Izuku watched the hero fly away for a few moments before turning to the paramedic. We'll get you bandaged up and back home, buddy. The paramedic waved Izuku forwards. This time, he followed. As soon as Izuku walked in the doors of the orphanage, there were at least 3 pairs of arms wrapping around him affectionately. Izu. One of the foster children screamed, grabbing onto his left leg. Her name was Akira, only 4 years old. Almost the same age Izuku was when he first came to the orphanage. Izuku. I saw you on TV. Another child screamed from the couch. You were saved by All Might. Izuku let out a breath. Apparently the news had arrived on scene only after Izuku had destroyed the area, and they all presumed it had been All Might who caused the carnage. Izuku set down his bag, sitting down at the table. Akira was still attached to his leg, and seemed to be refusing to let go. Good evening, Izuku, said Miss Sakura, the caretaker of the foster home. I'm glad you're okay. She walked over and set down a bowl of rice and chicken. Seems I missed dinner. Izuku gave her a smile back. I'm glad I'm okay, too. Didn't come away without some damage, though. He lifted his shirt, revealing the bandages wrapped around his abdomen. Miss Sakura gazed at the bandages before letting out a sigh. Izuku, are you really planning on going for the hero course? Miss Sakura asked, blunt as ever. She didn't sugarcoat anything she said, not even to spare a child's feelings. With raising over 10 children at a time, she didn't have time to play with formalities. They'd also had this conversation before. Yes, Miss Sakura, Izuku said, a hint of exasperation in his voice. One would think it harsh not to comfort Izuku after the villain attack, but Miss Sakura wasn't that type of person. She was more practical than that. She probably saw that he'd been the victim of a villain attack, and thought to use it as a tool to pressure him into staying away from the hero course. Little did she know, this night had done the opposite of discourage him. He was more encouraged than ever to get into UA's hero course. Not only did All Might have faith in him, but he personally defeated a villain. Most importantly, he figured out that there was far more to his abilities than he'd originally thought. That was the most urgent thing to figure out. He needed to find out how his abilities worked, what he could do with them, and most importantly, how he could keep it secret. Izuku, are you sure? Sakura pressed, her tone sharp but filled with concern. After today, and with her quirklessness she trailed off. My quirklessness won't stop me from trying, Izuku said, taking his bowl of food from the table. Thank you for the food. Izuku patted Akira on the head, and she released herself from his leg, at which point he walked up the stairs to his room, spooning the rice and chicken into his mouth as he walked. The silverware was old, used for years, and considering its age, it wouldn't be far-fetched that it was pewter or steel. They used to make silverware utensils out of those metals, never the world switched over to aluminum. Izuku shrugged the thought as he turned around and shut his door behind him, heading to his desk and pulling out his laptop from his backpack. Even though he had hoped otherwise, the computer was completely broken, the screen shattered. If his sudden manipulation of the metal in the area hadn't broken it, him being thrown around like a ragdoll did. Izuku scowled. That laptop had been not only expensive, but he'd been lucky to get it in the first place. It was his main source of hero research, and now it was completely useless. With a heavy sigh, he placed the broken computer on his desk and sunk into his chair. He knew he should be getting to sleep. He'd had a long and hard day and he needed to rest. Yet, he couldn't find the motivation to crawl in bed and sleep. Not with so much on his mind, and definitely not with so much to do. He needed to understand his power. That was the first step. Whatever his power was, it was dangerous, that much was evident. It could also be his ticket into UA. He needed to figure out how his abilities worked, and quickly. Honestly, I'm stupid for ignoring it for so long. Still, he had no idea how to start, and he did need sleep. With a sigh, Izuku took off his clothes, being careful not to stretch his side unnecessarily, and clambered into bed. With one last attempt before closing his eyes, Izuku felt for his luck once again. As he suspected, he found nothing, but that didn't stop him from getting disappointed. Izuku let out a huff and rolled over onto his uninjured side. He drifted into sleep quickly, his tired body needing the rest. Izuku woke with a start, sitting bolt upright in his bed. He tried to breathe, but the air came in shallow, quick bursts, and his hands were clammy, all of his extremities feeling exceptionally cold. Izuku swung his feet out from under his covers, sensing that something was very wrong. As soon as he tried to stand, a sudden wave of dizziness caused him to fall to his knees, the loose wooden floor resounding with a bang from his fall. The world spun around Izuku as he tried to calm himself down. Eventually, the dizziness went away and his vision cleared, only for a piercing headache to come in his stead. Izuku heard rustling from outside of his room, and a moment later, the door burst open, revealing Miss Sakura in her nightgown. Izuku tried to use his bed stand to pull himself off of the floor, but his legs felt exceptionally weak, and were unable to support his weight. Izuku, are you okay? I heard a bang, Miss Sakura said, taking a step further into his dark room. Izuku grunted, attempting to pull himself into a standing position. I'm okay. I just fell out of bed. His body betrayed his words as another wave of exhaustion washed over him, and he lost his grip on the bedpost. Izuku leaned over on the ground, head spinning. He barely registered Miss Sakura hurrying towards him in a panic before his vision faded to black. When Izuku woke up, he was in the hospital, the one place he'd not wanted to be the day previous. Now, he was stuck in a familiar set of white sheets and baby blue hospital gown. Izuku tried to sit up, but stopped as soon as he noticed the IV hook up to his forearm. They had him on a saline drip. Oh, look, just in time. A voice called, the door to his room sliding open. A tall man walked in, wearing a white coat, smiling broadly. He said it like it had been convenient timing, but Izuku had a feeling he'd been waiting outside of Izuku's room for a while, just waiting for the right moment to walk in. How are we feeling? Izuku groaned. Tired, he said truthfully. Whatever had happened, he felt exceptionally exhausted, like he could just lay down for a few hours and take a long nap, even though he'd just woken up. The doctor laughed. It's to be expected from a person with iron deficiency anemia. Izuku frowned, tilting his head. He'd expected it to be something to do with how his powers had acted up earlier that day, not something so mundane. The doctor must have read the look in Izuku's eyes, because he continued. Iron deficiency anemia is what happens when you don't have enough iron in your body. Without iron, your body can't make the hemoglobin required to move oxygen in the blood, Izuku finished. The doctor nodded, seemingly glossing over Izuku's interruption. Some people would have taken it as rude, cutting off an expert like that, but to his credit, the man appeared unfazed. We found that your body was almost completely out of iron. The only amount that existed within your body was that which was already contained within hemoglobin. This is especially odd, as you would have felt some sort of effect from a lack of iron far before it got to this point. So, tell me, in the last few days, perhaps weeks, have you regularly had headaches, shortness of breath, abnormal fevers, or exhaustion that doesn't seem to go away? Izuku thought for a moment. None of the symptoms sounded familiar, so he shook his head. I've been feeling pretty good, actually. The doctor frowned in response, scribbling something on his clipboard. The only other thing that I can think of is that it could be a side effect of a quirk. Do you have a quirk that may be responsible for using up the iron in your body? Izuku's mind flashed to the run-in with the sludge villain, how all the metal on the entire street had been displaced with enough force to crack concrete, drawn towards a singular point. He remembered how everything on the entire street had been destroyed, just by a few mere moments of power. I'm quirkless, Izuku said. However all of this related, however it all fit together, he needed to figure it out himself. His luck, the sludge villain incident, and now the fact that he was completely out of iron in his body, they were all related. They had to be. The doctor sighed. Well, we're going to keep you for 24 hours in order to ensure that there aren't any lasting effects. We've given you some emergency iron supplements for the moment, and you'll need to continue taking iron supplements for the next few weeks. The doctor said. Izuku frowned this time. He didn't like the idea of staying in a hospital for so long. He'd had enough time in a hospital for a lifetime, not to mention missing school, but it couldn't be helped. The doctor turned to leave, nodding to Izuku as he did so. There will be a nurse around to check on you every couple of hours. For now, it's the middle of the night and I'm in dire need of sleep. The doctor slid open the glass door to Izuku's hospital room. Wait. Izuku said, realizing something. The doctor stopped in his tracks, turning back to look at Izuku, who picked at his fingernails nervously. Finally, he spoke softly. I don't have the money to pay for this hospital visit. The doctor looked at him for a moment, before breaking into laughter. You didn't know? A few hours ago, the hospital received word that a local hero agency would be paying for your hospital bills in the case that you needed to come in within a day or two. I don't know what you did to get a hero agency's eye, kid, but someone's got you covered. With that the doctor left, sliding the door shut. All might, Izuku remembered. He'd said that he'd be paying for Izuku's hospital bills related to the incident, but was the iron deficiency related to the slime villain attack, or was it some sort of crazy coincidence? Either way, Izuku needed to thank All Might the next time he saw him. If I ever see him again, he reminded himself, slouching back into his hospital bed. It wasn't very long before he let the alluring pull of sleep take him over and all faded to black. The next day in the hospital went by without a problem. Miss Sakura brought nearly the entirety of the foster home to visit him, the onslaught of children nearly knocking Izuku's IV out of his arm when they'd attacked him with their hugs, but he appreciated it. They practically idolized Izuku, even though he sometimes felt he didn't deserve it. He was quirkless and never did anything of note, but they looked up for him for the simple fact that he was the oldest. That was also another reason that he hated going to the hospital. If the children who looked up to him saw him in such a feeble state, they might realize how normal he really was. The children stayed around for a little while before Miss Sakura had to take them to school, but in that time, Izuku got to read them a couple of storybooks, as well as tell them about the previous day's hero news. Usually, he talked about the most recent happenings of the hero world, but he hadn't gotten around to catching up since, well, the sludge villain incident. Luckily, Miss Sakura had concluded that his anemia was completely separate from the villain attack. Of course, she wouldn't have any reason to see them as related to begin with, but Izuku was a bit paranoid. Nobody knew about his luck, and up until yesterday, nobody else had known that he was anything but quirkless. Now, the only people that knew he was something else were the people on that street when the villain attacked. Eventually, Izuku was discharged early after showing no signs of his condition worsening. They said originally that he was going to be kept around for a day, but he wasn't complaining about being out early. As Izuku walked out of the hospital, he glanced at the clock on the receptionist's desk, who waved him farewell with a smile. It's noon. I've already missed school, and there's no point in showing up late, so I may as well use this time to my advantage, Izuku thought. He didn't have a smartphone to call Miss Sakura, so he'd have to make do with what he had, which, to be fair, was practically nothing. He had his wallet, his clothes, and knowledge of the Misatafu streets and public transportation. With a sigh, Izuku set off at a brisk walk towards the nearest bus stop. While the buses were good enough, the light rail would have been a significantly faster way to head straight home. Izuku didn't take the light rail. The first place he went was to the nearest appliance store. If he was going to figure out what exactly his power was, he was going to need access to the internet. Since going to a public library wasn't exactly an option, that meant he was going to need a laptop. Walking into the electronics store was almost a surreal experience for Izuku. Seeing all of the different computers and computer accessories, most of which were vastly out of his price range, was overwhelming, but at least the staff were helpful and accommodating. So less than half an hour later, Izuku walked out with a refurbished bare-bones laptop. All in all, it had costed him was about 10,000 yen. Izuku barely even gave Miss Sakura a greeting as he ran straight to his room as soon as he got back home. He crashed into his desk chair and pulled out his new computer and a hero notebook. Okay, Izuku thought to himself, what's the first step to figuring out how this power works when I barely have a lead? It seemed overwhelming at first. There were so many things that quirks depended upon that narrowing it down to one simple thing could be next to impossible. People often went through most of their lives without knowing exactly how their quirk functioned. So far, he'd seen a pattern with his powers. Whenever he used his luck, he tapped into some sort of reserve. It didn't feel like a part of his mind, rather, more like another muscle. Much like how you don't have to actively think about moving your arm to pick something up, he didn't have to actively think about tapping into the well of power. He just did it. The thing about his luck is that while he would only sometimes actually have any to use, the reserve was always there. Even if it was empty, he could always sense it in the back of his mind. So it's only sometimes there, but I can feel the reserve all the time, Izuku muttered as he scribbled notes in his notebook. It sounds like an engine. Izuku bit onto the end of his pencil, nibbling on the brass cap that held the eraser to the wooden pencil itself. It was a bad habit he'd fallen into. Engines worked off of fuel. When the gasoline was there, the engine could run, and when the gasoline ran out, the engine would shut off, but the tank that held the fuel still existed. When the tank was filled up again, the engine could run again. But if it's based off of fuel, then what's the fuel? How do I refuel? Izuku shook his head. So many questions. Izuku wrote down a list of possible things that could work, and began gathering the materials needed to test each theory. He tried all sorts of things with water and food first. A lot of quirks that work off of a fuel system are based in some sort of food or water consumption, so he ran through all the possibilities. Eating food, drinking water, taking a shower to cover himself in water, seeing if it was somehow related to the lipids in his body, but all to no avail. Nothing seemed to refuel his luck. So Izuku kept testing. Everything from eating salt to eating sugar to eating copious amounts of fruits. He tried everything he could think of that would be fuel, but nothing seemed to work. Defeated, Izuku crashed back into his desk chair, disappointedly crossing out his most recent list of ideas. He was running out of leads at this point. Perhaps he was mistaken and it wasn't based off of fuel. Maybe his stock was regenerated by something else. Izuku leaned back in his chair, nibbling on the end of his pencil once again, thinking. Ideas, ideas, ideas. What else could it be? Izuku thought back on all the times he'd used his luck. At school to get Kakin off of me, sometimes with Miss Sakura, sometimes with the children to make them calm down, then Izuku stopped. How could I forget? He berated himself, slapping his own wrist. I'm so stupid. He picked up his pen and flipped to a new page. The sludge villain incident and aftermath had one thing in common. One thing he completely glossed over in his initial search. Metal. Somehow, metal had to be involved. Between the metal being attracted to him during the villain attack itself and Izuku's entire visit to the hospital for iron deficiency anemia right after, it all had something to do with metal. Izuku ran through an entire new list of ideas. Maybe he could only activate it when he was touching metal. Maybe it had to do with how much metal was nearby. Smiling, Izuku set to work, all of his new ideas renewing his vigor. Of course, that made it all the more disheartening when he got stumped a few hours later, every single lead turning up dead. With a frustrated grunt, Izuku crashed into his seat for the third time in the last few hours, completely out of ideas. He raised a pencil to his mouth and began biting on it once again, this time more out of anger than anything else. Ugh. He groaned, leaning back. All of his leads were dead, and he had no idea where to go next. He couldn't exactly go to a quirk expert, as they'd just take one look at his file and tell him he's quirkless. He couldn't ask for help without accidentally revealing his powers that he wanted to remain a secret, and he couldn't figure it out on his own. He was stuck in a corner with nowhere to go. In a bout of childish anger, Izuku bit down as hard as he could. The brass end of the pencil snapped off from the force of his bite, disconnecting from the rest of the pencil inside of Izuku's mouth. The little metal tip must have had at least a little launch velocity, as it went sailing directly down his throat. Izuku sat up, hacking and coughing at the sudden surprise of accidentally swallowing a pencil end. Luckily, he hadn't inhaled it, he didn't need another hospital visit. Even as he coughed, he heard Miss Sakura's footsteps coming closer and mere moments before the door came slamming open. Izuku, are you alright? Izuku nodded, giving her a thumbs up. Water just went down the wrong pipe, he said, gesturing to the half-filled-up cup on his desk from one of his earlier tests. Miss Sakura eyed him and then the cup. Are you sure? It's not related to the hospital, she said suspiciously. Izuku just shook his head in response. I'm fine, I swear, Izuku said again, a bit exasperated. Instinctually, Izuku reached for his luck to give Miss Sakura the nudge she needed to leave him alone again. He reached to tap into the reserve before he even knew if it was there or not. Miss Sakura turned away just in time to miss Izuku's expression of pure shock. His reserve of luck, it was massive. Hundreds of times bigger than anything he'd ever used before. Somehow, he'd filled up his stock, and he'd filled it up a lot. Izuku frantically searched within his mind for what had elapsed in the last couple of minutes that could possibly give him a hint. I sat back down, wrote in my notebook a bit off the end of my pencil and swallowed. Izuku stopped, and everything clicked. The fuel source, the metal, it all made sense. Metal was the fuel source. He'd accidentally swallowed the end of his pencil, and the cap had been made out of brass. The brass was the fuel source for his luck, which meant that in order to power his abilities, he needed to swallow metal. Izuku looked around the room, searching for another pencil to test his hypothesis. He grabbed an extra writing utensil and removed the eraser cap from the end, leaving only the brass fashion to connect eraser to pencil. He eyed the little chunk, compressing it into as small of a ball as he could get it. Moment of truth, he thought, popping it into his mouth. With some effort, Izuku swallowed the brass bit and reached for his reserve of luck again. Sure enough, the reserve was even larger. A massive grin grew on Izuku's face. He'd done it. He'd solved his abilities. He could eat metal and use it as a fuel source for his powers. The more metal, the more fuel he had. Yes. Izuku cheered, jumping up into the air. All it had taken was a few hours of blind testing, until a random coincidence had solved it all for him. He'd taken the first step towards his goal of understanding his powers. Now, the only step left was to figure out all of the rest. Izuku wrote down a plethora of ideas about the possible implications of his discovery. What he'd been calling luck was actually brass. He'd gotten a little bit of brass at a time from the metal shavings from chewing on the ends of his pencils, or at least, that was his running theory. The next step was to get a grasp of his powers. He knew that there must be other metals than brass out there he could use, evidenced by the carnage he'd caused on the street. Though the idea of figuring out what metals produce what effects was tempting, it was probably a better idea to get a grasp of what he knew worked first, get a feel for the basics, then move on to others. So, Izuku procedurally removed the caps of an entire pack of pencils and stuffed them into his pocket, just in case he ran out of metal with the 2 brass pencil caps already in his stomach. Izuku grabbed his backpack and headed downstairs to initiate the first step of his plan. Get some spending money. He'd need to buy some metals to try out, and he'd used up almost all of his spare change on buying a new laptop. Good afternoon. Izuku chirped, strutting into the kitchen and to sit at the kitchen table. Miss Sakura looked over at him from the couch, a look of mild surprise on her face. You look like you're feeling better, she said with a grunt, turning back to the TV. She was probably watching some old soap opera with horrendous acting, a fact she seemed to be especially interested in. I am, I think, Izuku said. Those iron pills finally set in. Miss Sakura snorted. You'd better be feeling better, you ate just about half of my pantry. I'll need to go to the store because of you. Izuku scratched the back of his head nervously. Sorry, I was hungry. It wasn't entirely a lie, he had been hungry at the time. He just ate far more than he normally would in pursuit of finding the fuel source for his powers, not that it mattered in the end, because it turned out that he was a human scrap metal recycler. Silence fell between Izuku and Miss Sakura for a few moments, Miss Sakura on watching her show, and Izuku trepidatious about using his powers properly for the first time. He'd used brass in tiny amounts before, but this was going to be the first time that he really used brass. So, Izuku said, breaking the silence. I was wondering could I get some spending money. He tapped into the massive reserve, using the tiniest amounts of brass, about the same amount he would have used when his reserve was a mere fraction of what it was now. Miss Sakura looked over at Izuku again. Don't you have your own money? At least she didn't outright deny me, Izuku thought. That's a start. I had to use it to buy a new laptop. Mine broke yesterday, Izuku said, pushing a little harder. He knew that he wasn't very refined with his manipulation, but he'd become more adept with time. He felt a warm feeling from in his chest, and he noticed Miss Sakura's posture slump a little, as if she was becoming more relaxed. Izuku urged for her to become more believing, less skeptical. Well, she put her hand to her chin. What do you need to use it for? Izuku stopped. He hadn't thought up a lie to tell her, she asked. Still, he was getting somewhere. Izuku had asked for money many times in his years living at the foster home, and he'd never actually been successful. He'd never even really made it this far. Usually the response was a quick and finite no. He tried pushing a bit harder with brass. He felt his reserve shrinking quicker, probably due to the intensity at which he was using it, and a warm feeling in his chest spread a little. I suppose it doesn't matter, Miss Sakura finally said, shifting on the couch and grabbing her purse. Izuku didn't let up on the brass until Miss Sakura produced a few 1,000 yen bills and handed them to him, at which point the boy frantically shoved them into his pocket, grabbing his bag and heading for the door. Thank you, he called, cutting off the flow of brass. You're welcome. Miss Sakura trailed off as Izuku shut the door behind him, walking off in an excited hurry. It worked. He practically yelled, skipping down the street. He drew eyes from other people, but for once in his life, he didn't care that other people were looking at him. He headed straight for the nearest hardware shop. Izuku checked his brass. In that one short encounter, he'd used up nearly 3/4 of his storage. So, the more intensive an effect I want to produce, the more metal it uses. Interesting. Izuku grabbed another 2 pencil caps from his pocket and pressed them into as small of balls as possible. Then with a little mental preparation, he put the pieces in his mouth and swallowed. They were a bit hard to get down, but he felt his reserve replenished to a comfortable amount. I'm going to need something to help those go down easier. Water, maybe. Izuku thought, continuing his walk to the bus stop. Izuku needed to figure out exactly what the limitations of brass were. He suspected it had something to do with emotions, but that didn't quite make sense. While anger, what he typically suppressed with Bakugo, was an emotion, suspiciousness was more of a state of mind. He hadn't made Miss Sakura less angry, he just made her less wary and more open to his suggestions. Did that mean he could suppress anything? He needed to test his theories. The problem was, it wasn't exactly easy to tell how someone was feeling or thinking without outright asking them, and he suspected walking up to someone and saying, "So, just wondering, are you feeling any less sad at the moment?" wouldn't go over well. So, he needed another way to test, some way that he could see the results of his quirk in real time, all while also maintaining secrecy. The squealing sound of a bus rolling to a halt and the sounds of air compressors releasing drew Izuku from his thoughts. He climbed on board, scanning his transit pass and sitting down in the seat just adjacent to the door. Izuku looked over the other passengers, each occupied in their own ways. A woman was reading a book a few seats over, and a man stared out of the window on the other side aisle, a few seats in front of, and a small family with 3 rowdy children. Suddenly, an idea came to mind. He could test each of his theories by discreetly observing the other passengers as he used brass. Izuku sat a little straighter in his seat. It was probably an invasion of privacy to use brass like this, but at this point he didn't care. He needed answers. Okay, first theory, can I target specific emotions or feelings? Izuku looked over the passengers of the bus once more. Eventually, Izuku chose a target, one of the children of the family on the other side of the bus. This one was particularly rowdy, unable to sit still in their seat, and constantly nagging their mother. If this works, then I might be helping her out, Izuku thought, chuckling to himself. Hesitantly, he turned on his brass, letting it simmer slightly as he felt his chest get a little warm. Hesitantly, he reached out towards the child. Usually when children were rowdy, it was because they're bored, so the most likely reason the little boy was attempting to climb on his mother's shoulders, was simply that he wanted something to do. Izuku directed his brass towards the kid, thinking specifically about getting rid of the kid's sense of boredom. He started off softly, and when the child didn't seem to react much, Izuku doubled his efforts, pushing a little harder. If brass could be compared to the gas pedal on a car, he wasn't exactly flooring it, but he also wasn't letting it coast. Izuku saw the fruits of his labor when the kid eventually stopped squirming. He just sank down in his chair, staring at the ground. Izuku smiled. Now time for the second theory. If I use brass on someone, does it stay, or do they just go back to how they were feeling beforehand? Izuku let up and he felt the warmth in his chest retreat. The child didn't move for a bit, but when he finally did, it was to begin swinging his legs back and forth in the seat. A few minutes later, the kid was back to squirming. Izuku leaned back and thought. That could mean 2 different things. Either he no longer felt bored but went back to being bored, or brass's effect faded with time. Either way, the kid didn't seem to be acting suspicious of anything, or at the very least, that's what Izuku thought. You could only tell so much with a child. Izuku decided to move on from the kid to test his third and final theory for brass. Izuku was torn from his thoughts by the bus screeching to a halt. He looked up at the stop number, only to realize that it was his time to get off. With a sigh, he stood up. Next time, I suppose. Izuku walked into the hardware store, and the bell attached to the door rang to signal his entrance, its high-pitched ring echoing around the empty store. Welcome, how may I help you? The man behind the counter greeted with a large smile. He was tall, had blonde hair, and looked to be in his mid-30s. Izuku suppressed the urge to turn right back around and leave because he knew that the man was only trying to help. Hi, Izuku paused. I'm looking for metal. The man tilted his head. Metal? He eventually prompted when Izuku didn't elaborate. Small ingots maybe. Anything I can turn into small bits, really, Izuku said. He probably could have found it all on his own, but backing out now would only make him seem even more socially awkward. Well, the employee said, scrolling through the computer, you may find something on aisle 6. Otherwise, we might need to work something else out. We've been a bit stripped for resources lately. A nod. Thank you. Izuku walked down aisle 6, looking at the contents of the shelves. It had various tools that he presumed were typically used for woodworking, saw blades, sandpaper, the like on one side, and on the other, there seemed to be different assorted screws and bolts. At the very end of the aisle, however, was exactly what Izuku was looking for. Pouches of shaved metal filings, or at least, that was what he thought was supposed to be there. The entire rack was cleared out, except for a few pouches stacked on top of each other. Izuku grabbed one of them, reading the label. It was just a bags of tin flakes. Izuku looked down the aisle, seeing if there was some sort of mistake. Well, I suppose he did say they've been stripped for resources lately, Izuku thought, taking 3 pouches of the tin. Izuku got to the front of the store with the bags, slightly disappointed. He'd come to try to get a variety of metals to try and test, but all he was going to walk out was a single type. Begrudgingly, Izuku set the pouches down on the counter. So, what are all these for? The cashier asked as he scanned each of the pouches. Izuku paused. School project, he said simply. The cashier raised an eyebrow. What kind of school project? Izuku snapped his mouth shut. He didn't have a good explanation in mind, so instead he reached out with brass, targeting the man's suspicion. He pushed on the emotion, suppressing it as much as possible. Izuku felt the warmth in his chest swell up. Well, the man said, sighed, I suppose it doesn't matter, now does it? He smiled, and Izuku smiled in return, letting up a little. He didn't want to run through all of his reserve before he was back home. Say, what's your name? He asked. Izuku normally wouldn't have responded, he would have just looked down at the floor and dodged the question. Yet, for some reason, he suddenly felt especially trustworthy of this person. They were just a store clerk, what was the harm in letting him know? My name is Midoriya Izuku, he said, and as soon as he did, he felt an itch to bite his tongue to keep himself from talking again. Are you interested in chemistry and metallurgy? The clerk asked. Something like that, Izuku nodded. It wasn't exactly far off from the truth. The man gave Izuku the bag, smiling. Well, Izuku, here you go. Izuku frowned. The man was friendly, sure, but most people didn't just jump straight to using first names. Izuku shook his head, brushing it off. The man didn't exactly look Japanese. His skin was too pale and his eyes were too big, much like Izuku's own. He probably just wasn't fluent with the culture, though his Japanese seemed as practiced as could be despite his thick accent. As Izuku grabbed the bag, he noticed something odd. The man was wearing long sleeves, with the shirt tucked into white gloves, completely covering his forearms. Normally that wouldn't be very peculiar, but it was summertime. Nobody in their right mind wore long sleeves when it was so hot outside, unless they were begging sweat their balls off. Shaking his thoughts, Izuku reached for his wallet. So, Izuku said as he handed the man his money, do you know when the store is going to get more of those types of metal shavings? I'm looking for as many different types as possible so I can do tests for my project. Well, I don't know when exactly, but I could have the store send you a notice when they're back in, if you'd like. Izuku nodded, and the man began typing on the computer. After a few moments, however, he stopped. Say, the man said, turning his attention back to Izuku, I work a side job at a metal processing plant. We get a lot of scraps and shavings that we normally just throw away. I could just send them to you, if you want. Izuku would normally never actually accept the offer. He didn't like taking handouts, especially from strangers. Yet, for some reason, he felt abnormally calm when the man asked him. He even felt compelled to take the offer immediately. Well, would it cost me anything? The man shook his head. Free of charge. All I'd need to know is where to send it to. It could solve my metals problem. Izuku reasoned. And it would save me money. Well, if you're offering, he said eventually, deciding to trust the man. He smiled. Great. Izuku gave the man the address to the foster home. Oddly, he didn't actually write it down anywhere. How was he going to remember the address? Izuku shook his thoughts clear, deciding that part didn't matter. The clerk gave Izuku his change and a big smile, at which point the boy turned to leave. Before you head out, Izuku heard the clerk call, so he stopped and looked over his shoulder. Tried to smile a bit more, okay. Izuku blinked. What an odd thing to say in response. Izuku flashed the man a smile before turning to leave. As Izuku walked from the bus stop back to the foster home, he realized something. For some reason, turning on his brass didn't seem to fit as a phrase to describe his powers, as it didn't really feel like actually turning it on. It wasn't like flicking a light switch, but rather more like using a muscle. He could change the amount that he wanted to use, and how much of an effect he wanted to draw out. Izuku let his brass simmer softly and a warm feeling returned. He reveled in the feeling because it just felt right, like he finally had a part of him that he'd been missing for a long time. He smiled, letting himself sink into the warmth. It wasn't actually warming him up, that's not how thermodynamics worked, it just gave him an impression of heat. Izuku ran through possible ideas for how to refer to it, at least for his own sake. Use it. No, that's too generic. Flex it. No, that doesn't make sense. Izuku trailed off, watching one of the cars go by on the street. What was it he compared his abilities to? An engine. Engines burned gasoline for fuel. If Izuku's power was an engine, and metal was his fuel source, did that mean he was burning metals? That actually has a nice ring to it, Izuku realized. It also helped serve to explain the warm feeling he had whenever he had a metal on. Burning metals, I like it. As Izuku made the trek back to the foster home, he made an executive decision. Brass may be relatively harmless, but he knew from experience that some metal, had destroyed an entire city street. He needed to make sure that when he burned any metal for the first time that it wasn't anywhere that he could accidentally hurt somebody, which included the tin he carried in his pocket. Even if it turned out to be a dud, it was worth being safe. Izuku turned down the street and saw the foster home down the road. It was a small town house squished between a few other houses that looked nearly identical. The first thing he did when he got inside wasn't actually to go straight to his room. Before he did that, he needed to test his last theory regarding brass. Can people that use brass on know that their emotions have been tampered with? Izuku walked into the kitchen, noting that Miss Sakura was sitting in the same spot that she'd been when he left a few hours prior, the only difference being, this time, there were a swarm of other foster children running around. They were so loud that they could rival even the loudest of metal bands in terms of sheer sound volume. Doesn't Bakugo listen to metal? He seems like the type to, Izuku thought absent-mindedly as he shut the door behind him. With a sigh, he took a seat on the table, leaving his bag of metals stashed in his coat pocket. You didn't go straight to your room, I'm surprised, Miss Sakura said, not looking away from the television. Izuku sat quietly for a moment, pondering how to approach the conversation. He cleared his throat. I was just wondering, why did you lend me money today? You've never done that before, he asked. Miss Sakura actually snorted. I was just feeling a little generous is all. It's probably because of all this hospital business, don't think too hard about it. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. She didn't seem to be suspicious of her emotions being tampered with, so he got up, making his leave. As soon as he got to his room, Izuku crashed onto his bed, completely mentally exhausted. With a groan, he rolled over in place, noticing but not caring that the blankets were getting twisted around his legs. He let his hand rest on the pouches of tin stuffed in his pocket as he stared at the ceiling. As bad as he wanted to take a glass of water and send the tin down the hatch, he knew that he needed to wait. Something, one of the metals that he could burn, had the firepower to decimate a public street. If tin was that metal. Izuku's mind flashed to the image of the metal rebars sticking out of the concrete, then all the other foster children. I need to make sure that I don't put anyone else in danger. I need to figure these things out somewhere else. So long as he was unsure about any portion of the metal's function, he refused to endanger anyone else. Turning over in his bed, Izuku closed his eyes. Izuku woke up from his short nap to the sound of his alarm going off. He made the decision to sleep until midnight, just to get in a few extra hours of sleep. He still had school the next day, after all, and if he was going to be out all night, he didn't want to come in the next day with bags under his eyes. He slept on sweatpants, some shoes, and then a hoodie after checking the weather, and discovering that it was going to be on the chillier side, despite being summertime. While he was grabbing his sweatshirt, his eyes lingered on a cloak that hung from a hanger inside his closet. The cloak was a black cloth at the top, adorned with a hood and a drawstring. As the article got longer, it split off into numerous black and gray tassels, all of which faded to a light gray, foggy color at the bottom. It was one of the few things he kept from his childhood. It was the very cloak that he'd been wrapped in when his parents had found him on their doorstep all those years ago. Not a blanket, not a towel, but a cloak, and a very odd-looking one at that. Izuku had no idea he'd left him on that step, but whoever it was, it seemed like that particular choice was significant in some way, which was why Izuku couldn't find it within himself to get rid of it. It was important to at least someone. Izuku shut his closet door and made for the staircase that led downstairs. As he crept down, he put extra effort into avoiding the creaky spots, many of which he'd become familiar with after a few midnight escapades to the kitchen for a drink of water, so he made it to the bottom floor without a sound. Then, he slowly creaked the door open, and the moment he did, a thin white fog flowed inside, evaporating as it reached the light. Izuku frowned. It was the middle of the summer, sure, but he hadn't seen anything in the forecast about it being foggy. Izuku stuck his head out the door and looked out onto the street outside, only able to see the soft yellow light of street lamps shining through the fog, and the occasional passing of a car's headlights. He felt a foreboding chill run down his spine as he stepped outside, softly closing the door behind him. It's just water vapor, he reminded himself. By all rights, he shouldn't have a problem with, but for some reason, as the white fog coiled off of his skin, Izuku couldn't help but feel like it was sort of alive. Izuku shook his thoughts clear, straightening out his hoodie. Now, where do I go? He thought. I need somewhere that I won't need to worry about accidentally hurting someone. It didn't take long for the area to come to mind. The location in question wasn't very far away. In fact, he'd walked there many times before, as it was a good place to go when he wanted to be alone. If not for the mist obscuring his vision, Izuku knew the mounds of trash would have been visible from blocks away. The Dagaba Municipal Beach Park, once a clean open waterside lounging area, was one of the ugly parts of town. Over time, it had accumulated piles upon piles of trash, rendered into an illegal dumping zone, and home to his fair share of drug dealers. It was a shame that such beautiful public space had been rendered useless, but it also meant something good for Izuku. He had a place to practice his quirk where he wouldn't be in danger of hurting anyone else. When he finally got to the beach, he hopped over the wall, working his way over the piles of trash. Eventually, he found the spot he was looking for, a small clearing of clean sand in the midst of mounds of trash. The mountains of rubbish would hide him from any onlookers, so there was a low chance of being found, especially considering how the thick fog obscured anybody's sight for any distance further than a few meters, and the valley was just big enough that he could comfortably move around. Alright, here we go, he said, sitting down and taking the tin and his water bottle out of his pocket, setting them down in the sand. Izuku looked up and down at the materials, then around himself to check that he was alone, then back at the materials again. What are you waiting for? He scolded himself, grabbing the tin and taking a pinch of it. He put the metal flakes on his tongue, then washed it down with a big gulp of water. Reaching inside, Izuku looked for any other sources of, well, Izuku thought. When he'd swallowed the pencil tips, there had been one distinct power source inside of him, of which there were now two. One was the brass from the pencil caps he'd swallowed earlier. The other was completely unfamiliar to him. Closing his eyes, he focused on the new well of power, feeling that it was sharper than brass, in a way. Here goes nothing, Izuku thought. The instant he started burning the tin, everything around him seemed to erupt. The soft sound of the waves on the beach rolling in was elevated to a roaring noise in his ears, and the soft glow of moonlight became almost blindingly bright, shining through the mists like a second sun. In a panic, Izuku cut off the metal, and everything went back to normal. What the hell was that? He mumbled to himself, trying to clear his head. Of all the things he'd anticipated to happen below one of the mountains of scrap away, maybe whatever that had been wasn't on his list. Once he got his thoughts back in order again, he prepared himself to begin burning the tin again, and this time, instead of burning it at a full blast, he instead brought it to a low simmer. The world exploded into action again, though not nearly as drastic of a change as it had been the first time. Izuku could still clearly hear the waves in the distance, and the starlight lit up his vision, even through the mist. Izuku could taste the simple dinner of fried rice on his tongue, the sensitivity of his taste buds skyrocketing. Reaching down, Izuku took a handful of sand, letting it roll out of his palm, and he could make out individual grains sliding against his skin. So, this metal enhances senses, Izuku realized, nodding. He took off his shoes and socks, going barefoot on the soft sand before bringing the metal to a bit heavier of a burn. The starlight got brighter, and he could make out details from a further distance. If he listened carefully, he could hear the sounds of cars driving on the road that ran by the beach. I could get used to this, Izuku thought. Having acute senses that was a powerful enough ability in and of itself. There were heroes out there that had sense-enhancing quirks, and they tended to be very successful, especially in the underground. The first example that came to mind was Stethoscope, a hero whose sense of hearing was so acute that he could hear heartbeats, even from hundreds of meters away. He checked on his supply, recalling how a few minutes of constant burning had halved his brass supply, only to realize that it had barely gone down. The amount of the metal he'd swallowed was pretty minuscule, but he could probably burn it at this rate for at least a few hours without a problem. Izuku was amazed. He could feel the water from the mists on his skin, a refreshing chill against the ocean's warm breeze. He could see well into the distance, even despite the fog. It wasn't like the mist had gone away, it just seemed more translucent. Izuku bent down to get a drink from his water bottle. This is SSSSSSSK. Suddenly, a deafening screech came from behind him, and Izuku whipped around, throwing his hands to his ears to block out the unholy noise of metal scraping against metal, as an old microwave came tumbling down from the top of a trash pile. In a panic, Izuku extinguished his tin just as the microwave crashed into the sand, the grating sound ringing in his ears. Everything has consequences. The words echoed in Izuku's mind. They were something that his mom had told him, way back when he was younger. If you touch a hot pan, it will burn you. If you eat too much, you'll feel sick. The advice seemed oddly fitting. If I see something bright, or hear something loud while burning tin, it will be significantly worse than if I hadn't been burning it. It was something he'd need to be keeping in mind going forwards. The biggest challenge with the new metal wouldn't be figuring out what he can hear, see, or feel, it would be getting good at tuning unnecessary information out. Well, he mumbled, grabbing his water bottle and bringing tin to a soft burn once more. I came all this way for nothing. Even his voice was loud in his ears. Turning around and slipping on his shoes, Izuku headed back towards the foster home. He'd need to catch up on some sleep before he went to school. Katsuki woke up to the sound of his mother hollering at him to come eat breakfast. I'm up. Katsuki screamed, just so that she would shut the hell up. He threw on his school uniform haphazardly, not even caring to button it up all the way before slinging his backpack over his shoulder and waltzing out of his room and down the stairs. But, I thought I was going to have to drag your ass out of bed again, his mother said as Katsuki emerged from the staircase. He frowned, clenching his fists. Can't you wait for me to get down the stairs before you go complaining, old hag? Katsuki sneered. He tossed his bag on the floor next to the table before walking to the kitchen and grabbing a plate of food, crashing into one of the chairs. Slow the fuck down, you're going to break those things. He snorted. They haven't broken yet. Katsuki brought the plate to his mouth, scarfing down 2 pieces of bacon. Oi, turn on the news. Katsuki's father didn't say a word and didn't even look up from his newspaper at the table. He simply picked up the remote and pressed the button to turn on the TV. Katsuki smiled. Just another normal day, he thought. Katsuki only half paid attention to the news as he ate. He didn't study the articles intently like Deku. He didn't need that shit, it was just good to get a scope of hero activity in the area. Do you think Inko's son is going to come to school today? Mitsuki asked as she cleaned off a spot on the table and sat down. Fuck if I know, Katsuki said, shoving another spoonful of eggs in his mouth. I don't care what that shitty Deku does. It's his fault for getting overpowered so easily by a no-name villain anyways. Katsuki turned his attention back to the TV. Local hardware store attack was the headline. Katsuki snarled and grabbed the remote, turning up the volume until the reporter's voice soon became audible. An employee was found unconscious in the back of the store by one of their co-workers. Their uniform had been stolen and items in the store were rearranged. All security camera footage was wiped, and most of the merchandise had been taken off the shelves. Investigation by police is underway, but it is unlikely the culprit will be found with such little evidence to go off of. Boring, Katsuki changed the channel. Who cares about some random hardware shop? He flipped through the news channels until he found the one that covered hero news, setting the remote down. As soon as Katsuki finished his breakfast, he put on his shoes and grabbed his bag, not even bothering with a farewell as he left for school. Izuku didn't sleep very well. Turns out that waking up in the middle of the night for a few hours kinda puts a wrench in your sleep schedule. In fact, when his alarm clock went off in the morning, he'd been awake for some time, staring at the ceiling. With a groan, he heaved himself out of bed and got ready, throwing on his school uniform and running to brush his hair before grabbing his bag to leave. Before he did, though, Izuku stopped at his desk, looking at his water bottle. "Can't hurt to have some reserves," he mumbled, snatching the pouch of tin and a few crumbled pencil caps off of his desk. Just to be safe, before he went to bed the previous night, he'd burned off what remained of his reserves, wanting to avoid metal poisoning if at all possible. Down the hatch, he breathed, putting 2 of the pencil caps on his tongue, as well as a fair-sized pinch of tin, washing it all down with a big gulp of water. He cringed, recoiling at the metallic aftertaste in his mouth. That's going to be awkward to get used to. Izuku started burning the tin on a soft simmer, and his room immediately became brighter. The sound of the air conditioning unit got louder, and the disgusting metal aftertaste became even more profound. Although he knew what tin did now, it was going to take a lot of time to get used to the intense sensory input. Thus, he made the resolution that until he could function normally with tin on, he'd keep it burning whenever he was awake. His breakfast of simple oatmeal was one of the most intense experiences of his life. He could taste the nuanced blend of different spices, along with the smooth, yet crunchy feel of the oats rolling over his tongue. It was easily the best oatmeal he'd ever had. Similarly, the walk to school was short but overwhelming. With tin burning, the light that reflected off the concrete was almost blinding, the sound of cars and passing people deafening. The feel of the breeze over his skin sent shivers down his spine. I was just wondering if he heard a woman talk into her phone from across the street. "Did you do the homework for him today?" One of the kids that went to his school talking to a friend almost half of a block away. It was overwhelming, but it was also wonderful. He'd never felt like this before and it was indescribable. Is this what having a quirk, a real actual quirk, feels like? Izuku couldn't help but smile widely the entire rest of the way to school, even as his ears were assaulted by a cacophony. Deku was sitting in his seat when Katsuki got to the classroom, just like normal. Grimacing, Katsuki walked over towards his own seat, barely throwing the other boy more than a glance, though, in that small window of time, Katsuki noticed something odd. The wide, massive grin was planted on the bastard's face. Katsuki sneered, clenching his fists. He hated that smug look. What did he have to be smiling about? "Oi, Deku!" Katsuki shouted, and he saw the other boy jump in surprise, looking up. He was still smiling. "What are you smiling for? You got your ass handed to you by a villain the other day." Katsuki expected him to just look down in shame, or to apologize and try to slide into his seat, just like he normally did. "I woke up feeling good this morning." Deku shrugged, looking back down at his desk, running his finger up and down along the wooden top. Katsuki froze, anger welling up from the bottom of his chest. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Katsuki dropped his bag, speed walking across the room, explosions cracking at his fingertips. He only got halfway there before he stopped in his tracks. "Why do I care?" he thought, the anger fading and general annoyance rising up in his place. "This kid isn't worth my time. Whatever. I could have beat that villain without breaking a sweat." Katsuki turned back around, throwing himself into his seat. "I'm sure you could have." Deku responded, his voice hardly a whisper. "TCH. Katsuki leaned against his arm, waiting for the teacher to come in. Izuku could hear the sound of the chalk running against the board clearly from his seat all the way in the back of the classroom, almost to the point where it was distracting. He could take the whispered conversations, and he could tune out the sound of pencils scratching on paper. What he could not stand, however, was the unnerving rasp of chalk on the chalkboard. He almost stopped burning tin, and the only thing that stopped him from doing so was constantly telling himself that he needed to get used to it. Class came in a similar fashion. Izuku spent his time getting used to tin's enhanced senses, and the people in his class ignored him like normal. They didn't even approach him about the villain attack, something he was thankful for. Days passed as Izuku trained with his tin. He started getting used to tuning out distractions and singling out only what mattered. Additionally, on the brass side of things, he continued to practice singling out certain feelings from others, and how to vary the strength as needed. He slowly got a hang of turning off tin when he anticipated things like bright lights or loud booms coming, and he got used to flaring it when he wanted to focus on something in particular. He still was far from mastering it, however. He had a feeling that there were some ways that he could be abusing the quirk, so he had to keep telling himself that they'd come with time. Despite that, he was still impressed by his own progress. He also noticed some other things about the metal. As he got used to the enhanced senses, when he spent up all his tin to go to bed for the night, he felt oddly empty. Where the louder sounds and brighter lights had been overwhelming before, going back to normal senses was jarring. How did I live like this for years? Izuku found himself asking as he strolled through the new hero news on his laptop. He brought the brightness down to as low as it could go, a comfortable level for his tin-enhanced eyes. The world feels so much more alive like this. I can see things I never saw before, hear things other people could never hear, Izuku thought as he scrolled past an article about Kamui Woods and his suspected love affair with Mount Lady. This is help. Someone. Izuku froze. It was faint, barely audible to his ears. "And I'm burning tin." He immediately started flaring his metal and the world erupted around him. He shut his laptop, the light becoming like a floodlight to his vision, and he closed his eyes, just focusing on listening. He heard Miss Sakura cooking downstairs, and one of the kids in the house playing with their toys. Concentrating, Izuku tried his best to tune those out. Then, he heard it, crying. It was soft and muffled, as if it were traveling through a lot of material. A voice, "Are you going to fucking listen to me now?" Their words slurred together, as if other person who'd said them was intoxicated. Izuku stood up immediately, trying to pinpoint the noise, slightly reclining when his chair slid backwards, causing an ugly sound. It sounded like it was coming from his left, so he walked to that end of the room, pressing an ear up against the wall. "Why yes." A woman's voice came through as a sob. "Just you don't hurt me, don't hit me again." She faded back into soft sobbing. Izuku grabbed his arm to stop himself from shaking. It was coming from the building next to the foster home. Izuku clenched his fists, not able to move, trying to think. The building on the left of them was unoccupied, so it had to. The sound of glass shattering and a scream from the woman filled his ears. Izuku started running before he knew what was going on. He threw open his door and bounded down the wooden staircase, skipping 5 steps at a time. He wheeled around in the kitchen, throwing open the front door, ignoring Miss Sakura's confused call after him, but Izuku didn't stop to turn around. He ran down the sidewalk, keeping his tin flared. The bottoms of his feet screamed in protest as he ran across the rough concrete, but he ignored it. He ran in the direction of where he'd heard the disturbance. Izuku's suspicions were confirmed as he ran straight by the abandoned house directly adjacent to the foster home, continuing to the one on the other side of it. As he sprinted to the door of the second house, he heard the sobbing get louder. This was the right one. He ran to the door, throwing his weight against it, and slamming his hand down on the door handle with all the strength he could muster. The door gave in, blowing open with a blast of wooden splinters. Inside, there were 3 people. One was a woman, cowering in the corner with her hands above her head protectively. Tears were streaming down her face and she was bleeding from her temple. Standing over her was a man, half of a beer bottle in one hand, the floor below his feet bespeckled with liquid and glass shards. In the corner of the room, there was another person, a girl that seemed his age, pushed up into the corner and cowering, as if she were trying to hide. Izuku didn't have time to think. He sprinted forwards, throwing all of his weight into a tackle. He slammed into the man with his shoulder, putting all of the strength he could into the tackle, blowing the older man off of his feet. Izuku reached out to everyone around him, flaring his brass. "Call the police." Izuku screamed as he and the man hit the ground. He put all of his weight into the small of the man's back, while also making sure to grab the man's arms. He let his knee push down between the man's shoulder blades, using the rest of his weight to keep the arms pinned. The man was bigger than Izuku, but not so much that he couldn't hold him down with some effort. Izuku didn't have time to discriminate what emotions to soothe away. Instead, he just smothered everyone in the room with an emotional blanket, pushing as hard as he possibly could. The man below him just groaned drunkenly, squirming under Izuku's hold. He focused his brass on the man in particular, pushing as hard as he could, harder than he'd ever pushed before. The man just stopped moving, docile under Izuku's combined hold of brass and weight. The woman in the corner, the one who was injured, was still cowering, unmoving, sobbing uncontrollably. Izuku heard a girl's voice, the girl his age, quivering as she talked into the phone. He flared in and listened to the conversation, making sure to keep the man down. Luckily, either due to his drunkenness or the brass, most likely a combination of both, the man didn't try to fight back. Izuku held the man down until the police pried him off. "So, let me make sure I have all of this right. You heard someone call for help while you were walking by the house on the street and took it upon yourself to try to help?" the police officer asked. He had the head of a cat, some side effect of a quirk, although it might have been his quirk itself. He thought back on one of his classmates whose entire quirk was that his arms were replaced by bears. Izuku flushed, scratching the back of his head nervously. "Yes, that's right." The police officer frowned in response. After the police had gotten to the residence, they'd taken the man into custody and separated everyone out for questioning. "You know how dangerous it could have been. It's best to get professionals involved, especially when it comes to breaking into someone's house like that." Sorry. Izuku tapped his heel against his calf, looking down at the ground. "My legs moved on their own." The officer eyed Izuku. Eventually, he just sighed. "We can pass this off as being a good Samaritan, so you're free to go. If something new comes up regarding the situation, we'll contact you. You might need to testify as a witness in court," the man said, turning around and writing something on his notepad. "Try to be more careful, kid. There's a lot of dangerous people out there, especially for quirkless people." Izuku grimaced. He didn't have any of his medals on at the moment. A lot of police forces had someone with them that could either suppress quirks or detect when one was being used, and he didn't want anyone to get the wrong idea. Izuku looked around the area, getting ready to head back to the foster home. A few meters down the road, Miss Sakura was waiting, her arms crossed with an eyebrow raise. "Great," Izuku gulped. "I am so getting scolded." He turned to leave, but something caught his attention first, the sound of a car pulling away. Looking over his shoulder, he saw one of the police cars pulling away from the scene, a figure sitting in the back. Next to where the car had just been, standing barefoot on the concrete, was the girl who had called the police, a teenage girl his age. He hadn't actually gotten a good look at her in the heat of the moment. She was tall, taller than Izuku himself by at least a few centimeters, and she was wearing what seemed to be a simple nightgown, which was understandable, seeing as it was already a few hours past sunset. The most notable, however, was her hair, set up in a large ponytail. It was almost stiff-looking and frayed out towards the ends, a bit spiky. She was talking to another officer, though she seemed on the verge of tears. Izuku was just far enough away that he couldn't hear what she was saying. But with tin, Izuku reached out towards his reserve of tin, prodding the big well. He still had much of the tin he'd swallowed earlier, despite flaring it for a solid minute straight to find where the cries for help had been coming from. Izuku was just about to burn it and listen in on the conversation when he stopped. No, he told himself. That's their private business. I have no reason or right to intrude. He pulled away, looking forwards again towards Miss Sakura. Izuku was barely able to keep his concentration in class the next day. He didn't get a lick of sleep, and it was coming back to bite him in the ass. Though, not sleeping had been less of a choice and more of a side effect of his own overbearing thoughts. After some vicious ear-tugging and scolding from Miss Sakura for getting involved with the police again, he'd gone up to his room to lay on his bed and think, mostly about why the hell he got involved. Domestic abuse is a sensitive issue. A lot of the time when families struggle with it, it's an issue tied up in a whole nest of other issues, and pulling out a single straw could cause the entire thing to collapse. Abusees frequently make excuses for their abusers, and it wouldn't be that much of a stretch for the family to actually blame Izuku for breaking into their home. He'd thrown himself into an issue that he had no business being a part of, and by doing so, he'd made his life just that much more complicated. Yet, the mere thought of hearing that cry for help and doing nothing made his stomach turn. The idea of hearing someone in need and deliberately doing nothing to help, especially when he was in a position where he could help, made his insides boil. Izuku ran his finger up and down the wooden desk again, feeling the grain of the wood on his tin-enhanced fingertips. Midoriya, would you answer this question? The teacher asked, and Izuku drew his attention away from the desk, standing up in a hurry. Izuku looked at the board, then to the teacher. Could you repeat it? The teacher sighed. What does this sentence mean in English? He pointed to the line of kanji on the board. Izuku nodded, flaring tin. He noticed that it helped him concentrate, or at the very least, it supplied his mind with enough sensory input to push back his tiredness. It was an odd side effect, but useful. Izuku translated the sentence then sat back down. Izuku opened the door to the foster home after school, wanting nothing more than to just crash onto his bed and pass out for a few hours. I'm home, he sighed as he walked in, making a line straight for the staircase. Before you disappear for the night, you have a package. Miss Sakura said, pointing to the table. Izuku frowned, turning around. Package. Sure enough, sitting on the kitchen table was a little cardboard box, haphazardly taped shut with the address written on in Sharpie. A man came by today and dropped it off, saying it was for you. Miss Sakura turned back on her TV, looking away from Izuku. He went over, grabbing the box and hefting it. It was fairly heavy. He got to his room and set the box down on his desk, flicking the switch on the desk lamp. With tin, that was more than enough to illuminate the entire room. He took the box, which literally only had his address and first name written on it in Sharpie, and popped it open. Inside, there was a note, as well as 3 distinct ingots of metal and a file. The clerk. Izuku remembered. It had been at least a week since that encounter, so he'd nearly forgotten. Izuku, here's some metal like I promised you. This one has pewter, a metal used for old kitchen utensils, and it's an alloy of tin and copper. There's also a bar of iron and a bar of steel. I also included a file in case you needed to have smaller samples for your experiments. The letter wasn't signed, which was a bit odd. But Izuku hefted the 3 bars, looking at them. He hadn't been expecting the clerk to actually follow through on his promise to provide Izuku with free metal, but he wasn't going to complain. It was a free way to test out different possibilities, and he was going to need all the help he could get, considering he still had no idea what metal yielded the carnage that he'd caused on the street. Well, he mumbled. If I'm going to be out again tonight to test these, I'm going to need to get some sleep. He put down the bars on his desk and rolled onto his bed, not even bothering to change out of his clothes. He extinguished tin and closed his eyes, waiting for sleep to draw him in. Izuku, you have a visitor. Miss Sakura's voice called. You've got to be kidding me, 8 shekels, he said, sitting back up and burning tin again. He threw open his door and ran down the stairs, and at the bottom, Miss Sakura was standing in front of the door, talking with someone outside. I'm here. Izuku said, grabbing the door and opening it all the way so he could see who was there to visit him. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat. The tall girl with the black ponytail from last night, the one who'd called the police. Hello, Izuku said, suddenly nervous. Hello, the girl said. My name is Aoi Momo, and I was wondering if we could talk. Hello, the girl said. My name is Aoi Momo, and I was wondering if we could talk. Izuku froze, looking at her for a moment. This could be bad. Sure thing, sweetie. Miss Sakura opened the door, gesturing for Yaoi Rozu to step inside. Only then did Izuku recover from his shock to move out of the way. Thank you. Yaoi Rozu stepped inside, stepping past Izuku, who was just awkwardly standing to the side, unmoving. Any exhaustion that he had from the day had faded, only to be replaced by a subtle feeling of utter dread. Yaoi Rozu stood next to the table for a moment. She didn't make any moves to start anything, and neither did Izuku. The tension in the air was so tight that if it were tangible, he could have cut it with a butter knife. Finally, Miss Sakura spoke. You two can have a seat at the table, I'll make some tea. Izuku took the opportunity to rush over to the table, taking the seat opposite Yaoi Rozu. They sat in silence while Miss Sakura waited for the water to boil before pouring it into 2 separate mugs with a couple of tea bags each. Milk or sugar? She asked, setting down both of the mugs. The question was directed at Yaoi Rozu, since Miss Sakura knew already that Izuku liked his tea bitter. This is fine. Thank you, Yaoi Rozu responded kindly. Izuku could tell that she was tired just by the sound of her voice. Miss Sakura nodded curtly, leaving the room. Izuku stared down at his mug, watching the tea seep in, unsure of how to start the conversation. I mean, how do you start a conversation like this? Do I just say hey, sorry that I may or may not have thrown a wrench into your entire home life? Izuku breathed out, taking the tea bag out after only about 30 seconds, and raising the mug to his lips. He sipped it, and the flavor rushed over his tongue, each individual spice acute to his senses. He could taste the savory cinnamon and the sweet plum distinctly. It was a bit hot, but it was refreshing. You hardly let it seep in. I'd be surprised if it tasted like more than flavored water. Izuku looked up, mildly surprised by the sudden comment. Yaoi Rozu was looking between him and his mug, so he just raised it again, taking a sip. I don't like it to be strong, he said simply. More like if it were any stronger, it would be overwhelming. Yaoi Rozu just looked at him for a moment, before letting out a little snort. The snort turned into a giggle, and the giggle devolved into a light laugh. Izuku couldn't help but crack a smile as well. Well, I'm Yaoi Rozu Momo, it's nice to meet you. Midoriya Izuku, and Asane. I'm sorry, Yaoi Rozu said between laughs, you're just not what I expected. Izuku started, a bit taken off guard. I don't really know how to respond to that. It's just, I didn't expect the person that broke in my door yesterday to tackle my stepdad to the ground would be an awkward teenager who looked uncomfortable in his own shoes. Now, I get that a lot. The second part, I mean. The part about being an awkward teenager and stuff. Izuku said with a laugh. The awkward silence returned a moment later. Well, Yaoi Rozu started, I probably owe you an explanation. She took a deep breath to steady herself, before beginning, so, first off, I'm sorry about last night. Things got out of hand, and you had to get involved and, I'm sorry. The words flew out of his mouth before he could stop them. I threw myself into a situation that I had no right getting into. I should have just called the police, or gotten a hero involved or something. I probably caused a bunch of problems for you and your family, so I'm sorry. Yaoi Rozu looked at him for a moment, a little shocked. Finally. If I'm being completely honest, I don't know if I should thank you or not. It's really a complicated situation, isn't it? A sigh. I'll try my best to explain, and we'll see how I'm feeling at the end of the conversation. Izuku gulped, nodding. With that, Yaoi Rozu began again. Well, I'll start from the beginning. My family name, Yaoi Rozu, might be familiar to you. My father is the head of the Yaoi Rozu Foundation, a big name in the international trade business. I'll spare you the details, but a number of years ago, my father and my mother went through a rough divorce, and my mom won custody. We were poor for the first time since I could remember, but with my mom to lean on, I got through it. Yaoi Rozu took a deep breath, steadying herself. A year or so ago, my mom married my stepdad. I didn't see him a lot when they were dating, but I thought he was a nice enough guy. When we moved in with him, things were okay for a while. That was, until he got fired from his job. He started going to the bars more, and he'd come back drunk nearly every night. When he got drunk, he got angry, and when he got angry she trailed off, taking a shaking breath. He really wasn't a good man, was he? Izuku heard her breathing quicken, and her breathing was raspy, rather than the calm controlled breaths of before. Looking up, he saw a single tear roll down her cheek. Hey, Izuku tried to interrupt her, but she kept talking. When he hit Mom, she told me to not get involved. She got good at covering up her bruises. One night, I tried to stop him, but he just hit me instead. I should have called the police a long time ago, but Mom wanted to work things out. I think she really did love the good side of him, and if she was happy, then we could push through the bad parts, right? She's getting really worked up. You don't have to tell me all of this, Izuku mumbled into his shirt. Yaoi Rozu just shook her head. I think, Yaoi Rozu started again, that I'd wanted to call the police for a very long time. I tricked myself into thinking that what we had could get better, that we could be happy again. If he got a job, he'd stop going to the bar, so he'd stop getting drunk, and he'd stop getting mad. I thought that for months. Yet, when you came in last night, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I couldn't let that bastard hurt anyone else. They sat in silence for a moment, Izuku trying to take everything in. It wasn't exactly too out of the ordinary for cases like this. All of the domestic abuse cases he'd read about online usually were based on the victims thinking that things could get better. Izuku let out a sigh and a sniffle. Well, there's my life story, I guess. Izuku said, I don't know how to respond to that. Izuku raised her hand to her mouth, stifling a giggle. I wouldn't either, don't worry. I'm still sorry for messing everything up. If I had handled things better, then we might have been able to fix things the easy way. Izuku shook her head. I made my decision on whether I should thank you or not. She took a deep breath. While things might be a little hard for a little while, it won't ever be as bad as it was for these last few months. So, thank you Midoriya, for putting that bastard behind bars. Something flared up inside Izuku's chest. Not the kind of flare that came with burning metals, but rather, a surge of emotion. A surge of pride. Self-worth. Whatever it was, it felt good. Well, maybe I should leave before things get awkward again, Izuku said, standing up. I'll see you to the door. Izuku said, standing up as well, holding his mug. Izuku sniffed at the drink, flaring his tin and taking in the scents. Instinctually, he checked his reserves. Tin is okay, but brass is a bit low, he thought, reaching for his pocket, where he had a few balled-up pencil caps stored. Without a second thought, he put the bowl of metal on his tongue and raised his tea, taking a big drink to wash down the brass. Instantly, he felt his reserves swell. Looking up from his mug, he made to walk Izuku to the door. Only to see her looking at him, a mix of complete confusion on her face. Did you just eat a bowl of metal? Oh? Shit. Well, you see, Izuku sputtered. It's I need it for my quirk. I see. Izuku slowly nodded, getting ready to turn around before. The police officer yesterday told me you were quirkless, though. Bad. Very bad. Izuku thought, mind racing. Very, very bad. On his last option Izuku burned brass, not bothering to be specific about what emotions to target. Izuku just hit Izuku with a soft blast of soothing. It's a long story. Let's just leave it. He said hopefully. To his relief, Izuku started to nod. Then, to his dismay, she frowned again. I knew it. She said, taking a couple of steps away, startling Izuku. You have a manipulation-type quirk. What? I don't know what you're talking about. Izuku said. I just felt you tried to make me less suspicious. Shit. Izuku thought, how can she know? Everyone else I used brass on couldn't tell. Let's sit back down. Izuku said, turning off his brass entirely. He returned to the very same seat that he'd been at a moment before, and Izuku walked over, taking a seat, but he could tell by her posture that she was still wary of him. I feel like the one that's on stage now. A moment before, Izuku had been the one spilling her guts to him. I know you have an emotional manipulation quirk. Izuku spoke first. How? My stepdad has one too. His amplifies the emotions of those around him when he uses it. It's part of how he kept my mom and I in line, so I know what it's like to have your emotions tampered with. Izuku said, I had a hunch after last night. The sudden shift in emotions could have been from either his quirk stopping, or from someone else. It seems that the latter was correct. Izuku sighed, defeated. Caught between a rock and a hard place. You basically told me your life story. I guess I owe you this one. Izuku said. It's odd, really. I haven't told anyone else about this, not even Miss Sakura. Ironic that the first person that will know about my quirk is someone I just met today. Izuku took a deep breath. The quirk registry still has me down as quirkless. That's because, up until about a week and a half ago, I thought I was. It wasn't until recently, when some extraneous circumstances brought to light the true nature of my quirk. He still wasn't entirely sure what was up with the metals, and whether or not it could really be called a quirk, but she didn't need to know that part. Izuku pulled a pencil cap out of his pocket, before popping it into his mouth and swallowing it dry. He was getting better at that part, at least. I can swallow metal and use it up to do certain things. Brass lets me suppress emotions. He hit Izuku with a little push of it to emphasize his point, and tin enhances my senses, which is why I could hear your mom's call for help last night. It's also why I kept my tea weak. Izuku took a deep breath, realizing that he'd said basically all of that without as much as a breath in the middle. He spewed it all out in a matter of seconds thanks to his nervousness. Izuku looked at him for a moment, before raising her hand to her mouth again with a giggle. You sure are nervous. I don't see why you are so concerned about keeping it a secret. It's just a quirk, I'm sure everyone will understand. And you should go get your quirk registry updated. It's illegal to have one that is deliberately incorrect, I think. But if you want to keep it a secret, I won't tell anyone. Izuku sunk into his chair in relief. I won't tell anyone about your family stuff either. Deal? Izuku said, though, if I may ask, what circumstances came to light that led to you eating a piece of metal? Izuku let out a chuckle. Well, you see, it wasn't actually that started it. There was an incident, and my quirk must have activated on instinct. Except, instead of using up the metal in my stomach, as I didn't have any, it actually used up all the iron in my body, and iron in his body, consumed. Blue lines. A destroyed city street. It clicked. Midoriya. Izuku said when Izuku suddenly stopped talking, looking up at her for a moment in shock. Izuku waved her hand in front of his face, as if to check if he was spaced out. Sorry. he yelled, bolting for the staircase. I think I just realized something. Wait right there. As soon as Izuku was in his room, he threw open his desk drawer, grabbing his most recent volume of Hero Analysis for the Future. He didn't even bother to shut the drawer before running back out of his room, skipping steps on his frantic flight down the staircase. If it uses metal content in my body as the fuel, then when I first used my quirk, it consumed all the iron in my body. That must mean, Izuku mumbled, sitting down in one of the chairs at the table, throwing his notebook open to the page that he began to build on his own quirk. If it used up the iron, that means that it has to be a metal that I can burn. But I hadn't eaten any iron, so that must mean that it can use up metals located elsewhere in my body, like my bloodstream. Midoriya? Yaoirozu asked, confused by the sudden outburst. Izuku, however, was too consumed in his own mumblings to notice. Does that mean that metal just has to be somewhere inside of my body for it to be used? Isn't iron usually stored as atoms within molecules inside of the bloodstream? Does that mean that I can use up metals that are bonded? If so, where does the leftover molecule go? Could I accidentally poison myself by making a compound that's poisonous? Izuku stopped for a moment. I need iron. Izuku stood back up in an instant, knocking over his chair in his hurry. He ran to the drawers and cabinets around the kitchen, throwing them all open. Silverware is made out of silver and pewter. He shut the utensil drawer, opening another. Is this made of iron? Iron, I need iron. Something small enough to swallow, Izuku mumbled, opening drawer after drawer after drawer. Midoriya? Yaoirozu practically yelled. Izuku's head snapped up, looking over to where she was standing. In her hand, there was a small gray bead. He tilted his head, walking over. You said you needed some iron. She smiled, gesturing to her hand. Izuku took the bead, rolling it over in his palm. Where'd you get this? He asked. It certainly looked like iron. I made it with my quirk, she said. Izuku looked up at her in awe. With your quirk? Yaoirozu nodded. It's called creation. I can make anything, so long as I know the chemical structure. As if to demonstrate, in the palm of her hand, an assortment of blue and pink particles came into existence, and a moment later, another bead of iron was sitting in her hand. Izuku breathed in shock. That's so cool. Completely forgetting about the iron bead in his hand, Izuku threw open a new page of his notebook, writing down Yaoirozu's name and the name of her quirk at the top. That's so versatile. You could make so many different things. It's practically built for hero work. You could learn to make a bunch of different weapons, or even dangerous compounds to use as weapons against villains. How does it work? What does it use as a fuel source? Can you make an unlimited amount of stuff, or do you need to take breaks? So many options. Well, it uses my lipid cells, as Yaoirozu cut herself off. Hey, weren't you just freaking out about needing to have iron for something? Why are we on my quirk now? Izuku froze mid-sentence, looking up. Whoops. He stood upright once more, awkwardly shutting his notebook, reaching up with one hand, and scratching the back of his head. Sorry, I get a bit excited sometimes when it comes to new quirks. Yaoirozu let out a little laugh, I can tell. Anyhow, you were going to do something with iron. Izuku jumped, as if just realizing how off-topic he'd gotten in a matter of a few seconds. He took the iron bead in his hand, looking it over. Here goes nothing, he said, popping the bead into his mouth, swallowing it dry. He'd gotten used to dry swallowing metals recently. Reaching inside, he felt for anything odd. Sure, just like with tin before it, there was a new reserve sitting there, ready to be used. Well, despite the bead he swallowed having been tiny, the reserve of iron was massive in comparison to what it should have been. He almost felt inclined to start theory crafting on why, as the other metals seemed to be replenished by similar amounts in relativity to the amount of metals swallowed. Later, he told himself. Okay, here we go. He steeled himself, perfectly aware of Yaoirozu standing next to him. Reaching towards the new reserve, Izuku started to burn iron. Immediately, blue lines shot out from his chest, seemingly in all directions. What the hell? Izuku breathed, looking around the room. The blue lines were mostly transparent, non-obtrusive to his vision, yet they're enough that he could clearly see them. They spanned out in every direction, only disappearing when they hit something like one of the cabinets or wall. Can you see this? Izuku asked, gesturing around him. Yaoirozu just tilted her head in confusion. See what? These lines. Blue lines, going everywhere. Yaoirozu just shook her head. No, I can't see anything. Izuku frowned. Checking his iron reserve, he saw that the metal seemed to burn relatively slowly. Not as slowly as tin, but he'd last a while on this amount. Let's see where this goes. Izuku singled out one of the blue lines, moving around the room. As he walked, one end of the line stayed attached to his chest. Wherever the end of the other line was seemed to stay put as well, just the angle of the line changing to adjust for his movement. Frowning, Izuku followed the line, tracing it to its source. He walked over to the counter, looking at where the line ended. A spoon, he mumbled, picking up the utensil that had been sitting on the counter. Even in his hand, a line shot from his chest towards the spoon. Looking around the rest of the room, Izuku searched for the other ends of lines. Forks, the stove, the teapot, the buttons on his school uniform, the refrigerator. All of them had lines attached to them. What did all of those things have in common that something like the table, which didn't have any lines oriented towards it, didn't? Metal, they're all made of metal, Izuku said, so iron points out sources of metal. Is it? His mind flashed back to the carnage on the street, the metal rebar ripped from its foundation, merchant stands torn apart by having their nails removed. No, there's more to it. Izuku looked up at the spoon in his hand, holding it up to the light above him and focusing on the blue line. Izuku felt as if there was something important about the line, almost like he could. Izuku pulled on the blue line. Suddenly, the spoon was ripped from his fingers and sent flying directly downwards towards him by some force. Izuku yelled, trying to duck, but the spoon curved in midair, pulled directly into his face. Ow! Izuku yelled, extinguishing iron. The spoon fell limply to the floor as all the blue lines disappeared from around him. Midoriya, are you okay? He heard Yaoi Rozu call, her footsteps loud to his ears. Izuku sat up, rubbing his forehead where he'd been struck. That spoon, it attacked me, Izuku said, getting on his feet, leaving the spoon on the ground. He looked up, trying to piece together what the hell had just happened. He looked at Yaoi Rozu, who just looked at him for a moment, her expression unwavering. PFFT, she snorted, beginning to laugh, there's a red mark on your forehead. Izuku flushed, throwing a hand up to his forehead, trying to cover it up. That only made Yaoi Rozu laugh even more. Eventually, Izuku couldn't keep himself from laughing, and found himself chuckling at himself. You just, Yaoi Rozu said between laughs, you hit yourself with a spoon. She let out an ugly wheeze, which just served to make Izuku break out into uncontrollable laughter. I swear, it came alive and attacked me. It was a solid few minutes before either of them were able to gather their composure again. Even then, they were both left smiling like a bunch of idiots. Well, I'll leave you to attacking yourself with spoons then. Yeah, Izuku said, I'll let you go do whatever you have to do now. Izuku responded, walking with Yaoi Rozu to the door. She grabbed her bag off of the hanger and made for the door. Well, Midoriya, I'll see you at school in a few days then. Yaoi Rozu said, grabbing the door handle. Izuku tilted his head, you go to the same school as me. Yaoi Rozu shook her head, not yet. I was homeschooled for a long time, but I want to take as much pressure off my mom as possible, so I'm going to start going to public school in a couple of days. Ah, I see, Izuku muttered, then, I'll see you then. Yaoi Rozu stepped outside, see you around, spoon-kun. Izuku smiled as she left. Izuku tried to sleep while he waited for night to come around. After his sudden revelation as to the nature of iron, he'd realized something that caused his heart to sink. Before, he'd gone to the Dagaba Municipal Beach Park because he had wanted to be sure that he didn't want to endanger anyone around him with the metal that had destroyed the street when the sludge villain attacked. Then he turned right around with tunnel vision and used the very same metal inside of the house. In his excitement, he'd gotten tunnel vision and put everyone else in danger. What if it had done something more than just hit me with a spoon? What if I had caused the building to collapse? Izuku groaned, staring at the ceiling. Izuku looked over at the clock. It's midnight. He sat up, swinging his feet off of the bed. He was tired as hell, but the combination of his excitement from iron and his anxiousness from the stupidity of his mistake had kept him up. His eyelids feel heavy, but he powered through. Walking over to his desk, Izuku grabbed a few pouches of metal shavings from earlier. In the hours he'd waited for everyone to go to sleep, he'd taken the ingots of metal supplied by the clerk he'd met, as well as the file, and made pouches full of each individual metal. Stuffing the pouches into his pocket, Izuku slipped on some tennis shoes and went to his closet to get a sweatshirt. He slid open the closet, looking inside. To his surprise, it was completely empty, all save for one article of clothing, hanging from the rack. Miss Sakura, you always choose to do my laundry at the worst times. Izuku sighed. He checked the forecast on his phone earlier, and it was supposed to be cold. Going out without a sweatshirt would be unpleasant, especially with tin. What can you do? Izuku was about to turn away from the closet when his eyes were drawn to the last remaining piece, hanging on the rack. He grabbed it, pulling the black cloth off the hanger. The black and gray cloak that he'd been delivered to Inko and Hisashi in, 14 years ago. Izuku eyed the odd clothing piece for a moment, strangely drawn to it. He kept it as a memory of where he'd come from, a reminder almost. Now, for some reason, he felt drawn to it. The way the many-layered tassels faded to an odd gray color was interesting. He felt the cloth in his hands, basking in how smooth it felt, as if it weren't even made of real cloth. It was absurdly lightweight, and he barely felt it weigh down on his hands. Against his better judgment, Izuku threw the cloak over his shoulders. The tassels reached just above his feet, stopping just short so that it didn't drag against the ground. The solid part around his shoulders comfortably fit his chest, the drawstring in the middle holding each side on. Lastly, he kept the hood down, not caring enough to put it all the way on, letting it sit around his neck, almost like a sweatshirt. I feel like I'm cosplaying something, Izuku muttered, turning to leave. Still, he kept the cloak on. It felt surprisingly natural and unobtrusive to wear, and for some reason, it just felt right. He couldn't put his finger on why, but some part of him felt attached to the cloak. Izuku turned around, leaving his room and creeping down the stairs. It was another misty night. The oddly thick fog swirled in the dark, obscuring vision. At least, it would obscure the vision of anyone without tin to aid them. Izuku maneuvered over piles of trash, finding the clearing that he practiced at with his metals last time. Sure enough, it was still there, a small circle of sand amidst mountains of discarded appliances, bags of garbage, and scrap metal. Okay, Izuku said. Now, I can only hurt myself. Izuku shifted in the cloak, reaching into his pocket for the pouches of metal, and pulling out one of them at random. Pewter it is, then, Izuku mumbled to himself. He needed to get through all of them eventually, so the order didn't matter. Izuku took a pinch of pewter, putting it into his mouth and washing it down with a big gulp of water. Just like with all the other metals, a new reserve sprang to life within him. It was distinct from brass and iron. Though, he did notice something as he inspected it. There seemed to be some sort of connection between tin's reserve and the new well that was pewter, almost like a tie of sorts. Curious, Izuku reached out and began burning pewter. Unlike the immediate reaction he got out of burning tin, Izuku didn't notice anything at first. There was no blast of new sensory input, and he didn't really see any changes to things around him. Unlike with brass, it didn't feel like he could direct the new metal towards something. Confused, Izuku kept burning, flaring the metal. Once again, he didn't really notice any difference. Until he moved. Izuku had reached for his water bottle, and drastically overshot the movement, his limbs responding faster than he'd been expecting. Instead of leaning forwards to grab the bottle, he jolted forwards as if on uncontrolled muscles, and he lost his center of balance. Before he could stumble, however, as if his body knew what to do automatically, Izuku regained his footing on the soft ground. Ha! Izuku looked down at his body incredulously, like it had moved without his command. Except, the thing was, it had responded to his command, just way quicker than he'd been expecting. Carefully, Izuku took a few steps around. Once again, his muscles reacted far quicker and more precise than they had any right to. He noticed something else as he stood, as well. His sense of balance was impeccable. When he moved around on the beach, the shifting of the sand below didn't even give him pause, and when he'd reached down for his water bottle, there wasn't a single hint of vertigo. He turned around, walking in circles around the clearing, and he felt remarkably good. Just moving around felt more natural than it ever had, if that was even possible. All of his motions felt calculated, fluid. When Izuku grabbed the lid to his water bottle, the cheap plastic was crushed in his fingers. Ha! Izuku muttered, looking at the crumpled piece of plastic in his hand, and everything clicked into place. That's why I felt that bond between tin and pewter. They're connected in that one enhances the senses, while the other enhances physical attributes. That didn't solve the problem of his broken water bottle lid, though. Going over to one of the piles of trash, Izuku found a hefty-looking piece of garbage. It was an old car door, broken off at some point and separated from the rest of the car. Izuku extinguished the new metal, checking the weight of the piece of trash. Without the assistance of the metal, he could just barely lift up the car door, much less move around with it. Except, when he tried again with the new metal, it got a lot easier. It wasn't like he could suddenly lift it all with one hand or something like that. He wasn't All Might. It was more like a minor boost. He walked around, hefting the car door. It was still a little bit of a strain on his arms, but nothing more than what, say, a heavy backpack would have been. When he flared the metal, it got even easier, and it felt like carrying something not much heavier than a few kilograms. Then, it all seemed to get a lot heavier. Izuku yelped as gravity tore the door from his hands, and all the books spilled across the floor. He hadn't been keeping an eye on his metal levels, and he'd run out without realizing. The weight he'd been able to hold just because of his enhanced muscles was suddenly too much. I just swallowed some. Izuku groaned, checking his reserve. Sure enough, it was completely gone, not a hint of pewter left. The same amount of metal that tin could have lasted for about an hour on was gone in just mere minutes of burning. Irritated, Izuku pulled the pewter flakes out of his pocket, dumping the whole bag into his mouth and swallowing. He began to burn pewter at a soft level, and everything instantly felt better. His balance came back, his sense of exhaustion disappeared, and the biting feeling of the cold on his skin lessened. Pewter didn't just enhance his strength and speed. It enhanced every physical attribute, if only slightly. The strength boost wasn't anything like having an enhancement-type quirk, either. It was just enough to be noticeable to himself, yet concealable at the same time. I could get used to this. It was the same thing he'd said with tin. Granted, he'd need a lot more pewter to keep up the same habit that he had with tin, but it was probably a good idea to keep it burning while he was awake. It was going to take some time to get used to the new movement granted by pewter. Thus, Izuku let the metal simmer alongside his tin. Izuku pulled out the last 2 pouches of metal, one iron, the other steel. In the back of his mind, an idea was forming. Iron and steel were pretty similar to one another. Steel was just carbonized iron, after all. On a hunch, Izuku took a pinch of both metals, putting the filings into his mouth, and washing them down with water. He immediately felt 2 very similar reserves spring to life. One was the iron that he'd burned earlier. The other reserve felt very similar to the iron, and just like with tin and pewter, there was a tie between iron and steel. Izuku took a deep breath, steeling himself. Tentatively, Izuku reached out and burned both iron and steel at the same time. Immediately, blue lines shot from Izuku's chest outwards in every direction, connecting themselves to various sources of metal in the area. Earlier, when I hit myself with the spoon, Izuku started to mumble, "It didn't come alive" or something like that. "I did that to myself, didn't I?" Izuku singled out one of the blue lines, one that was connected to a small metal bar a few feet away. He felt at the line, thinking out his options. He flared iron, and the blue lines got brighter, but he also felt an odd urge pull. Trusting his instincts, Izuku mentally reached out and pulled on the line. The metal bar sprang to life, shooting off of its resting place a few meters away. This time, unlike with the spoon, he was ready. He stuck his hand out, and a split second later, snatched the flying metal bar out of the air. "Iron pulls," he said. "What does steel do then?" The answer seemed obvious. Izuku held the bar out in front of him, looking at the blue line. This time, flaring steel, he pushed on the metal bar. Sure enough, the metal sprung into action, shooting out of Izuku's hand quickly, where it sailed for a few meters, before embedding itself in one of the mounds of trash. Then, much to Izuku's surprise, he felt a sudden wave of vertigo as he was thrown off of his feet. He yelped as he was launched into the air and backwards by some invisible force. Gah! Izuku let off the steel, and a moment later, he fell back to the sand. Pushing himself onto his knees, he spat sand out of his mouth. What the hell was that? He pulled himself onto his feet, albeit a bit too quickly, causing him to nearly lose his balance again, and looked in the direction that he'd been thrown. "Is somebody here?" he called into the mists. All he was met with was the gentle swirling of the fog. Izuku looked back towards where he'd embedded the metal rod into the pile of trash. He looked over cautiously, searching for any signs as to what might have thrown him into the air like that. "Iron pulls and steel pushes," Izuku said to himself, but what was that at the end? "I only fell once I stopped pushing," Izuku realized. That at least meant that steel was somehow involved. Carefully burning steel once more, the blue lines got more vibrant. That's another theory down. Iron and steel can both see lines, and they overlap if I'm burning both, he thought. Iron and steel also both burn slowly, it seems. Okay, so I pulled the bar towards me, Izuku thought, retracing his steps. After that, I pushed it away, where it got stuck against the pile. As soon as that happened, Izuku trailed off, his mind flashing back to something that Inko had told him many years ago, when the kids bullied him at school. A lot of the time, the bigger kid wins. If someone is bigger than you, Izuku, you'll get pushed around easier than if a kid your size is pushing you around. Remember that, so you know when to run away. It clicked. When I pushed on the bar at first, it was smaller, so I could push it around. But when it hit the pile, suddenly it was a part of something bigger than me, so I got pushed around instead. Izuku mumbled. In his excitement, he whipped around looking for where various blue lines connected to. Within the vast piles of trash, it was next to impossible to tell where specific pieces of metal were. Still, he found exactly what he was looking for, a slightly thicker blue line that led to a washing machine. Here we go. Izuku waked over, looking at the large appliance. It was slightly buried underneath garbage bags, but flaring pewter was enough to dig it out, where he placed it in the middle of his little clearing. The bigger boys push harder. The heavier things won't get pushed around. Izuku stood on top of the washing machine. They'll push me around. He burned steel and pushed on the washing machine below him. The mists blew into his face as Izuku shot straight up into the air. Wind rushed against his face as he shot up like a bullet. Still, he didn't lose his cool. 10 meters, then 20 meters. His pushing slowed as he got further away. 30 meters in the air, and Izuku forced himself not to look down. He could just barely see the blue line that connected him to the washing machine below, but he could still push. He slowed to a stop at what had to be about 40 meters in the sky. Izuku looked around, making sure to keep pushing on the washing machine below with steel. It sure pushed back, alright, Izuku sighed. Looking down, even his tin-enhanced eyes could see nothing but the mist swirling below him, as well as the faint, barely visible blue lines connecting him to sources of metal below. I'm really high up, Izuku said, trying to stop himself from hyperventilating. Okay, hypothesis true, but holy shit, I'm stupid. Izuku slowly let off on the push below, and he felt himself slowly sink down, losing altitude as he let off on how hard he was pushing on the washing machine. As he got close enough that he could see the ground once more, he felt his heart slow, the panic retreating. When his feet landed on the sand once more, he collapsed to the ground, wishing that he could hug it. I could have died, Izuku realized. What if the washing machine was off-center and I went flying into the ocean? What if I landed on one of the trash piles and impaled myself? Izuku cursed himself for being so reckless, and once he was done with that, he slapped himself a few times, as if to knock sense into his head. Thinking about it a little, he knew that there was a real reason for why things worked that way. When he pushed on something, he was probably using a force around or equal to his body weight. When he pushed on something smaller than him, it got pushed away. But if he tried to push on something bigger than him, his body weight wasn't enough to move it, and if the thing he was pushing on couldn't move, then he needed to move instead, which is what led to him getting thrown away. The same concept applies too if he's pushing on something smaller than him, but it doesn't have anywhere to go, like if he were to push against a coin on the ground, for example. Izuku knew there was going to be a lot of intricacies to the metal, but the possibilities were already running rampant in his head. The possible uses that pushing and pulling had were nearly endless. Using metal as projectile weapons, using iron and steel to push or pull people out of danger, pushing on the metal on someone's outfit to knock them off balance in a fight, using the blue lines to track enemies with metal on their person, using metal as a means of quick mobility. There were so many implications of iron and steel alone, not to mention in tandem with the other metals he already had at his disposal. There was so much to learn, with so little time before the UA entrance exams to learn it. There were a lot of things he knew that he hadn't even thought of yet. All of those things were indications of one thing for Izuku. He was going to need a lot of practice.